I've always known there was something different about the Black Ridge Woods, not in the way city folks talk about nature being magical or peaceful. They've never spent a winter night listening to the wind howl through the pines like a dying thing, or watched the shadows move when there's nothing there to cast them. These woods have teeth, and I learned young how to avoid getting bitten. My name's James Hawkins, though most folks around here just call me Hawk. Been living in these parts for 43 years, following in my father's footsteps as a trapper and guide. Pa wasn't what you'd call a conventional teacher. While other kids were learning their ABCs, I was learning which mushrooms would feed you and which would make your heart stop. He'd take me deep into the forest before dawn, teaching me to read the story written in broken twigs and disturbed leaves. Nature speaks its own language, he'd say, and a man's life depends on learning to listen. Those lessons weren't always gentle. When I was 12, Pa left me alone in the woods for 3 days with nothing but a knife and the clothes on my back. Said it was time I learned what the forest had to teach. I still remember that first night, huddled in a hollow log while something big circled my makeshift shelter, breathing heavy and slow. Never did see what it was, but I learned right quick about respect. The woods don't care about your plans or your pride. They've got their own rules, written in a script older than words. That's how I came to know the regulars in these parts. Old Bill Mason, who runs the general store in town and always seems to know when a storm's coming before the weather service does. Sarah Thompson, our sheriff now, tough as old leather but fair-minded. We're a tight-knit bunch, us edge-dwellers. Have to be. Town folks think we're backwards, calling us mountain people like it's some kind of insult. But we know better. We're the ones who remember the old ways, the ones who still know how to listen when the woods speak. I made my living as a guide mostly, taking wealthy hunters into the backcountry after deer or elk. Some years back, I started doing survival training too. City people paying good money to learn what Pa taught me for free. Funny how things work out. But it kept me in ammunition and coffee and let me stay where I belonged. The woods were my home, my workplace, my church, all rolled into one. Looking back now, I should have noticed the signs sooner. The way the birds went quiet in mid-song, how the deer started avoiding their usual watering holes. Even the black bears, usually bold as brass when it came to raiding camping sites, disappeared almost overnight. Nature was trying to tell us something, but I'd grown too comfortable, too sure of my place in these woods. Pride makes a man deaf to warnings, Pa used to say. And I was about to learn just how right he'd been. It started with the dreams. Not nightmares exactly, but the kind of dreams that leave you drenched in sweat, heart hammering against your ribs like it's trying to escape. Dreams of something moving through the trees at night, something that walked like a man but wasn't. Something that knew my name. I'd wake up to find my hunting dog, Duke, growling at the darkness beyond my cabin windows, his hackles raised and teeth bared at shadows I couldn't quite see. I'd been alone in these woods for so long, I'd forgotten what real fear felt like. But I was about to remember, and the lessons that followed would change everything I thought I knew about these ancient forests and the secrets they keep buried in their depths. Planning a serious trek into the deep woods isn't like taking a walk in some city park. Every ounce you carry could mean the difference between life and death, especially when you're tracking something unknown. I spent 3 days gathering supplies, checking and double-checking my gear. My old Remington 700 got a thorough cleaning, though something in my gut told me regular bullets might not be enough this time. I pulled out my father's journal, leather-bound and weather-beaten, its pages yellow with age. Pa had been more than just a hunter. He was a keeper of old knowledge, the kind that gets passed down in whispers around campfires. Between detailed notes about animal tracks and weather patterns were stranger things. Drawings of creatures that shouldn't exist. Warnings about places in the woods where the shadows fell wrong. Sarah Thompson stopped by while I was preparing. She'd known my father, respected him more than most. "Hawk," she said, leaning against my porch rail. "Word's getting around about strange things in the high country. Hikers gone missing up near Devil's Backbone. Found their camp torn apart like something was looking for something specific." She paused, studying my face. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? I told her about the dreams, about Duke's behavior, about the unnatural quiet that had settled over my section of the woods. She listened without interrupting, her face growing grimmer with each detail. When I finished, she pulled something from her jacket, a file folder thick with reports spanning decades. "Your father kept records too," she said quietly. "Things he saw out there that didn't make sense. Things that followed patterns we're seeing again now." The reports painted a disturbing picture. Every 30 years or so, the woods seemed to wake up. People would vanish. Animals would be found mutilated in ways that defied natural predators. And always, there would be tracks, huge prints that started like a bear's but changed, becoming more human-like before vanishing entirely. The morning I set out, the forest was wrapped in a fog so thick it seemed to swallow sound itself. Duke stuck close to my heels, which was unusual for him. Normally he'd be ranging ahead, nose to the ground, but something had him spooked. The weight of my pack pressed against my shoulders, each item carefully chosen. Emergency medical supplies, 3 days of concentrated food, water purification tablets, extra ammunition, and my father's journal. The trail I chose wasn't on any official map. It wound up through the hills like a snake, following game trails and old logging roads that nature had mostly reclaimed. As we climbed higher, the vegetation changed. The familiar oaks and maples gave way to darker evergreens, their branches hanging low and heavy with moss. The air grew thinner, but also heavier somehow, like it was charged with electricity before a storm. By mid-afternoon, I knew something was wrong. The forest floor was littered with dead birds, dozens of them, their bodies intact but lifeless, as if they'd simply fallen from the sky. Duke wouldn't go near them. He kept whining, pulling at his leash to head back down the mountain. I'd never seen him act like this, not in all our years together. Then I found the first real evidence that we weren't alone. A clearing that shouldn't have been there. Trees pushed outward from the center like something massive had landed or emerged. The ground was scorched in a perfect circle, and in the middle, half buried in the earth, was a deer carcass. But this wasn't any normal predator kill. The animal had been turned inside out, its organs arranged in a deliberate pattern around the body. The precision of it was almost surgical. I knelt to examine the scene closer, my hand instinctively tightening on my rifle. The blood was fresh, couldn't have been more than a few hours old. That's when I noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, not even the wind in the trees. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The sun was setting faster than it should have been, shadows stretching like grasping fingers across the ground. I knew I should make camp, but something drove me forward. Each step took me deeper into territory that felt increasingly wrong. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes. Some seemed to face me as I passed, though I told myself it was just tricks of the light. Duke's whining had turned to a constant low growl. His hackles were raised, head swiveling from side to side as we pushed forward. The temperature had dropped dramatically, my breath coming out in visible puffs despite it being middle of summer. The air felt thick, almost gelatinous, like walking through invisible spider webs. That's when we found the cave. It wasn't marked on any map, and I'd swear it hadn't been there last season. The entrance was perfectly round, as if something had melted its way through the rock. Warm air flowed out of it, carrying a smell that made my nose burn, like rotting meat mixed with ozone after a lightning strike. I don't know what possessed me to enter that cave. Maybe it was foolish courage, or maybe something was calling me in. The beam of my flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Duke refused to follow, planting himself at the entrance with a whimper. The tunnel descended at a steep angle, the walls smooth and slightly warm to the touch. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. My flashlight began to flicker, and that's when I heard it. A sound no human throat could make, like metal scraping against metal, but somehow organic, alive. I swung my light toward the sound and saw it. It stood 9 feet tall, its body a nightmare collection of angles that shouldn't exist. The skin, if you could call it that, shifted like oil on water, never settling on one color or texture. But it was the face, or rather, faces, that broke something in my mind. Dozens of them, human and animal, rippling across its surface like reflections in disturbed water. Some I recognized, missing hikers from over the years, a few local hunters who'd vanished without trace. Then it moved. It didn't walk or run. It folded, like paper being creased by invisible hands, covering the distance between us in an instant. The smell hit me first like burning plastic and decay. My flashlight died completely, but I could still see it. It generated its own light, a sickly phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with what I guessed was a heartbeat. I fired my rifle. The sound was deafening in the confined space, but the creature didn't flinch. The bullets passed through it like it was smoke, leaving brief holes that sealed themselves instantly. It reached for me with limbs that bent in impossible ways, fingers splitting and multiplying like fractal patterns. I ran. I wish I could say it was a conscious decision, but my body moved on pure instinct. I dropped my rifle, dropped my pack, and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Behind me, that terrible scraping sound grew louder, accompanied by a high-pitched keening that made my teeth vibrate. The tunnel seemed longer going out than coming in. My lungs burned, muscles screaming as I scrambled upward. I could feel it behind me, getting closer. The air grew colder wherever it passed, like it was sucking the heat out of the world itself. Duke's barking guided me to the entrance. The setting sun nearly blinded me as I burst out of the cave, but I didn't stop. My dog fell in beside me as we crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. That's when the trees began to move. The forest came alive around us. Trees didn't just sway, they twisted, their branches reaching down like grasping hands. Roots erupted from the ground, trying to tangle my feet. The thing behind us made that awful scraping sound again, and I swear the trees responded, bending away from it like they were afraid too. Duke and I crashed through the undergrowth, taking paths that shouldn't have existed moments before. The sky had gone wrong. Where there should have been sunset, there was now just a sickly green twilight that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My lungs were on fire, legs moving on pure adrenaline. Then Duke yelped. I turned to see a root wrapped around his back leg. Without thinking, I pulled my hunting knife and hacked at it. The wood screamed, actually screamed, and black sap that looked too much like blood spurted from the cut. I scooped up my dog and ran. The thing behind us was getting closer. I could feel its presence like a cold weight pressing against my back. The faces in its surface were screaming now, a chorus of voices begging for help, for mercy, for death. Some called my name in voices I recognized, people who'd gone missing over the years. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I don't remember exactly how we made it back to the cabin. Everything after sunset is a blur of motion and terror. I remember crashing through the door, Duke still in my arms. Remember slamming it shut, throwing every lock, pushing furniture against it. The windows. I boarded them up with shaking hands, nailing blankets over the boards. The thing stayed outside, circling. I could hear it moving. That terrible scraping sound growing closer, then farther, then closer again. Duke huddled under my bed, whimpering. I sat in the corner with my backup rifle across my knees, though I knew now it would be useless. It was the longest night of my life. Sometimes I heard voices, my father's, old friends, even my own, calling from the darkness. The thing was trying to lure me out. Around 3 in the morning, the temperature dropped so low my breath frosted in the air. The walls creaked and groaned like they were being pressed from all sides. Just before dawn, everything went silent. The pressure lifted. When the sun finally rose, I waited another hour before looking outside. The clearing around my cabin was different. The trees had moved. They formed a perfect circle now, their trunks twisted and scarred. The ground was covered in strange marks. Not footprints exactly, but places where reality seemed to have folded in on itself, leaving creases in the earth. The following weeks were hard. I couldn't sleep without seeing those faces, hearing those voices. Duke wouldn't go more than a few feet from the cabin, and he'd lost all his joy for hunting. I found myself jumping at shadows, flinching at every creaking branch. Sarah Thompson came by after I missed our weekly check-in. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, then showed me something that made my blood run cold. Satellite photos of the area spanning 30 years. Every 3 decades, the same pattern appeared. Trees arranged in perfect circles, moving outward from that cave like ripples in a pond. Your father saw it too, she said finally. Left notes about it in a locked drawer at the station. Said it was getting stronger, spreading further each cycle. Said it wasn't just one thing up there. It was like a tear in the world, letting something through. I asked her why she hadn't told me before. She just looked at me with tired eyes. Would you have believed me? Some things a person has to see for themselves. But now you know why we don't go up past Devil's Backbone after dark. Why we keep the old ways, the old warnings. That was 5 years ago. I still live in my cabin, still trap and hunt, but never alone now. Duke passed last winter, peacefully in his sleep. But I've got a new dog. A big German shepherd named Rex. He's good company. And he knows which parts of the woods to avoid. The thing in the cave hasn't shown itself since that night, but I know it's still there. Sometimes I see signs. Dead birds arranged in patterns, trees that move between one visit and the next. The cave itself has vanished, the entrance sealed like it never existed, but the air still feels wrong up there. Thick, waiting. I've started teaching survival classes again, but different now. I teach people to read the woods, really read them. Not just tracking and foraging, but the old knowledge. Which trails to avoid when the moon is full. Why you should never whistle after dark. How to recognize when a patch of forest isn't quite right. Most folks think I'm just spinning tales, adding atmosphere to their wilderness experience. That's fine. Better they think I'm just a superstitious old mountain man than know the truth. But some of them, the ones who've spent enough time in these woods, who've felt that watchful presence in the dark, they understand. Last week, I found fresh tracks up near where the cave used to be. Not animal, not human, but something in between. The trees are starting to twist again. Very slowly, very slightly, but I recognize the pattern. 25 years to go before the next cycle. I'll be too old to face it by then, but I've started keeping my own journal like my father did. Recording everything I've seen, everything I know. The woods have teeth and they're always hungry. But if you know how to listen, if you know how to read the signs, you can avoid being bitten. Most days anyway. I still dream about that thing sometimes. Its impossible angles, its faces, the way it moved like reality was optional. But I've made my peace with it as much as anyone can. Because here's the truth I've learned. We think we've tamed these woods, mapped every inch, named every species. But there are older things here. Things that were ancient when the first humans walked these hills. Things that will be here long after we're gone. The best we can do is remember the old ways, respect the old boundaries, and hope that when darkness falls, we're on the right side of the tree line. Some nights, sitting on my porch with Rex, watching the shadows lengthen between the trees. I think I understand what my father meant about the forest speaking its own language. It's not just the rustle of leaves or the cry of birds. It's something older, something that lives in the spaces between heartbeats. And if you listen carefully, very carefully, you can hear it whispering. The woods have teeth, and they remember. The night shift changes a person. After 15 years in the Marines and another 5 working security, I thought I knew everything about darkness. But that was before October 2008, before the incident at Mount Baker Research Station that turned my understanding of reality inside out. Just like, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. My name's Henry Little Bear. I grew up on the Yakima Reservation, where my grandmother filled my head with stories of ancient spirits and shapeshifters, while my father pushed me toward more practical pursuits. He'd served in Vietnam, came back with a Bronze Star, and the firm belief that the modern world had no place for old superstitions. I followed in his footsteps, enlisting right after high school. 3 towers later, I came home with my own collection of medals and nightmares. The security job at the research station seemed perfect at first. Quiet nights, decent pay, and enough solitude to help me process my time overseas. The facility itself was a cluster of modern buildings, nestled high in the Cascade Mountains, studying everything from glacier movement to atmospheric changes. Most nights, my biggest challenge was staying awake during my rounds or making small talk with the occasional late-working scientist. I'd gotten to know most of the research team over my 2 years there. Dr. Williams, the project lead, was a stern woman who seemed to live on coffee and grant proposals. Then there was Claire Chen, a young postdoc who always had a smile and a cookie to share during my midnight rounds. She reminded me of my sister. Same quick laugh, same fierce intelligence. The rest of the team came and went with the seasons and funding cycles, their faces blurring together in my memory. What I remember most about those early days was the silence. Not the peaceful kind you might expect in nature, but something deeper, more absolute. The kind of quiet that makes your ears strain for any sound at all. The surrounding forest was old growth, towering cedars and Douglas firs that had stood watch over these mountains since before European boots ever touched Pacific Northwest soil. My grandmother would have said these trees had spirits, ancient ones that didn't take kindly to human intrusion. Back then I dismissed such thoughts as folklore. Now I'm not so sure. I had a routine those nights: check the perimeter sensors, monitor the security feeds, walk the grounds every 2 hours. The research station had 8 main buildings arranged in a rough circle, with various storage sheds and equipment shelters scattered around the periphery. The whole compound was surrounded by a high fence, more to keep wildlife out than people in, though lately the fence had been showing signs of damage. Deep gouges in the metal posts, sections of wire inexplicably twisted. Maintenance blamed it on bears, but I'd seen bear damage before. This was different. The warning signs were there, looking back. The gradual disappearance of small wildlife from the area. The way the birds stopped singing weeks before they should have migrated. Even the air felt different, heavier somehow, like the moment before a massive storm. But humans are good at ignoring what we don't want to see. At rationalizing away the impossible until it's staring us in the face. Or in my case, until it was crouched over the mangled remains of someone I knew. The day everything changed started normally enough. I arrived for my shift at 6 p.m., just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of pine and something else. Something metallic that reminded me of gun oil and blood. I should have recognized it as a warning, but 5 years of routine had dulled my instincts. I went through my usual equipment check: flashlight, radio sidearm, a Glock 19 that I'd never had to use, and the tablet that controlled the facility's security systems. Everything was in order, though the tablet had been acting up lately, showing strange glitches in the camera feeds. Tech support blamed it on electromagnetic interference from the research equipment, but that explanation had never sat right with me. Dr. Williams caught me at the security desk during handover. She looked more harried than usual, her silver hair escaping its usual tight bun. "Henry, we've had some equipment go missing from storage shed 3. Expensive stuff. Could you keep an extra eye on it tonight?" I nodded, making a note in my log. "Any signs of forced entry?" She hesitated, something flickering across her face. "Fear? No, that's the strange part. The locks were intact, but items are definitely missing and—" She trailed off, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "And?" I prompted. "We found some strange markings inside. Probably just vandalism, but—" She shook her head. "Just check it thoroughly during your rounds, please." I promised I would, watching as she hurried back to the main lab. There was something she wasn't telling me, but that wasn't unusual in a place like this. Scientists could be secretive about their work, especially when millions in grant money was involved. The first few hours of my shift passed quietly. I made my initial rounds, paying special attention to Storage Shed 3. Everything looked normal from the outside. No broken windows, no scratches around the lock. Inside, though, I found what Dr. Williams hadn't wanted to discuss. The markings weren't vandalism. They were more like claw marks, Deep gouges in the metal shelving that no bear could have made. They formed patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. Geometric shapes that seemed to shift when viewed directly. I took photos with my phone, though something told me they wouldn't come out clearly. Sure enough, when I checked the screen, the images were blurred and distorted, as if something had interfered with the camera. This should have been the moment I called for backup, reported my findings, did something. Instead, I convinced myself there must be a rational explanation. That decision would haunt me for years to come. The research station had always felt isolated, but that night, the isolation took on a different quality. It wasn't just distance from civilization. It was as if we'd somehow slipped into a pocket of reality where normal rules didn't quite apply. The security cameras began showing intermittent static around 9 p.m., the interference growing worse as the night wore on. The perimeter sensors kept triggering false alarms, always in a pattern that seemed to be moving clockwise around the compound. I tried radioing the nearest ranger station, but all I got was static and what sounded like whispers in a language I didn't recognize. The landlines were dead, and cell service had always been spotty up here. None of this was particularly unusual in bad weather, but the sky was clear, stars sharp and cold above the trees. Claire found me in the security office around midnight, clutching a tablet and looking pale. "Henry, I need to show you something," she said, her voice tight with controlled fear. She pulled up a series of thermal imaging scans taken over the past week. "These are from our atmospheric monitoring equipment. Look at the pattern." The images showed heat signatures moving through the forest around the station. Not the usual warm blobs of deer or bear, but something that seemed to change shape from frame to frame. Sometimes it appeared human-sized, sometimes much larger. In several frames, it seemed to split into multiple forms before merging back together. "What am I looking at?" I asked, though part of me already knew this wasn't anything natural. Claire's hands were shaking slightly as she zoomed in on one image. "Whatever it is, it's getting closer, and it's not alone anymore." She opened her mouth to say more, but a sudden power surge made the lights flare blindingly bright before plunging us into darkness. The emergency generators kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. That's when we heard the scream. The scream came from the direction of storage. Shed 3. It wasn't the kind of sound a human throat should be able to make, starting as a woman's terrified shriek but morphing into something deeper, more guttural. Claire grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "That's Sarah," she whispered. "She was running some late-night tests in the auxiliary lab." I shouldered my rifle, a Remington 700 I'd been authorized to carry after the recent wildlife incidents, and headed for the door. "Stay here," I ordered Claire. "Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me." She nodded, face pale in the emergency lighting. The emergency generators cast everything in a bloody glow that made the familiar grounds feel alien. My boots crunched on frost-covered grass, strange given it had been well above freezing an hour ago. The air had thickened, becoming soupy and hard to breathe, carrying that metallic scent I'd noticed earlier but stronger now, mixed with something else, something rotten. As I approached storage shed 3, I noticed the temperature dropping further. My breath came out in visible puffs, and ice crystals were forming on the surrounding vegetation. The security light above the shed's door was flickering erratically, creating a strobing effect that made the shadows seem to move. The door hung open, swaying slightly in a wind I couldn't feel. My training took over, marine instincts that had never quite gone dormant. I swept my flashlight beam in a practiced arc, checking corners and shadows. The shed's interior had been transformed. Every surface was covered in a thin layer of frost, and those strange geometric patterns I'd noticed earlier had spread, covering the walls and ceiling in impossible angles that seemed to twist in my peripheral vision. Sarah's research equipment lay scattered across the floor, some pieces still gently smoking. Her tablet was cracked but still functioning, displaying rows of readings that made no sense. temperature measurements far below absolute zero, radiation levels that should have been lethal, atmospheric pressure fluctuations that defied physics. That's when I found the first body. Not Sarah's. One of the maintenance workers, Thomas. He was sprawled across an equipment rack, his body contorted in ways that suggested every bone had been broken and reassembled wrong. His face was frozen in an expression of such profound horror that I had to look away. But what disturbed me most was his eyes. They were gone, replaced by what looked like small, crystalline structures that caught the light and reflected it back in rainbow patterns. A wet, sliding sound from the back of the shed made me spin around, rifle raised. In the strobing light, I caught glimpses of something moving between the shelves. Something big. My flashlight beam caught it for just a moment, a mass of shifting shadows that seemed to absorb the light. Then it moved, faster than anything that size should be able to, and I got my first clear look at what we'd been dealing with. The creature stood at least 9 feet tall, its form constantly shifting like smoke in wind. It had too many limbs, all of them ending in long, crystalline claws that clicked against the concrete floor. But its face, God, its face. It was like looking at a dozen different animals at once, features flowing and morphing between wolf, bear, human, and things I had no names for. Multiple eyes opened and closed across its surface, all of them reflecting that same crystalline structure I'd seen in Thomas's sockets. In that moment, every story my grandmother had ever told me came rushing back. Tales of ancient spirits that walked between worlds, of shapeshifters and skin stealers that preyed on the unwary. The old people had called them by many names. But looking at this thing, I understood why some traditions refused to name them at all. Names had power, and some things shouldn't be given any more power than they already possessed. The creature's form rippled, and suddenly Sarah's face emerged from its surface, mouth open in a silent scream. Then it was gone, replaced by Thomas's features, then others I didn't recognize. I realized with horror that it wasn't just mimicking their appearances, it had somehow absorbed them, taken their very essence into itself. My finger tightened on the trigger, but before I could fire, the thing moved. One moment it was across the room, the next it was right in front of me, moving in a way that hurt my eyes to watch, like it was folding through dimensions that shouldn't exist. The temperature plummeted, and I felt something cold brush against my mind. An alien consciousness trying to make sense of my thoughts the way a child might examine an insect before pulling off its wings. I fired. The rifle's report deafening in the confined space. The creature's form rippled where the bullet struck, but it was like shooting smoke, each hole sealed instantly, the bullets dropping to the floor with soft pings. Their metal transmuted into the same crystalline substance I'd seen in its victim's eyes. My training said to stand and fight, but something more primitive, something that remembered being prey, screamed at me to run. For once I listened to that ancient instinct. I turned and sprinted from the shed, my boots slipping on the increasingly ice-covered ground. Behind me, I heard that sound again, that impossible scream that contained too many voices. The world around me had changed. The research station's familiar buildings were distorted, their shapes somehow wrong, as if reality itself was being warped by the creature's presence. The emergency lights cast multiple shadows that moved independently of their sources, and the air had become so cold it hurt to breathe. I ran for the main laboratory, hoping to find Claire and the others to organize some kind of defense. But as I rounded the corner, I saw that the building had changed. The walls rippled like heat waves off hot asphalt, and through the windows I could see impossible geometries, spaces that folded in on themselves in ways that made my head hurt to look at. The creature was toying with me. It could have caught me easily, but instead it herded me, appearing in flickers of movement that blocked certain paths, forcing me toward the forest. Each glimpse I caught of it showed a different form, sometimes running on too many legs, sometimes flowing like liquid shadow, sometimes breaking apart into multiple smaller shapes that moved with horrible coordination. As I reached the tree line, my radio crackled to life. Claire's voice came through, broken and distorted. "Henry!" "Don't let it. The others are. It's not killing them, it's changing them." The transmission dissolved into static and that same whispering I'd heard earlier, but now I could almost understand the words. Almost, but not quite, and I thanked God for that small mercy. The forest ahead of me was transformed. The trees had grown impossibly tall, their branches twisting together to form archways and spirals that pulsed with faint, sickly light. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy and unstable, as if the very earth was being reshaped by whatever force had invaded our reality. Running through that twisted forest was like moving through a nightmare. Every natural law seemed to be breaking down. Gravity shifted unpredictably. One moment I was running uphill, the next the ground tilted and I was scrambling sideways along what had been a vertical slope. Time became fluid and unreliable. The moon kept changing position in the sky, sometimes appearing multiple times at once, each showing a different phase. The trees themselves were alive in ways they shouldn't be. Their branches reached for me with deliberate purpose, bark splitting to reveal crystalline structures similar to what I'd seen in the creature's victims. The air was filled with whispered voices. Some I recognized as Claire and the others, some speaking languages that no human throat could produce. My lungs burned with each breath, the air so cold it felt like inhaling shards of glass. The creature's presence had transformed the forest into something alien, a place where the thin membrane between realities had been torn open. Every instinct I had, both human and animal, was screaming that this place was wrong, that merely being here was an offense against nature. Behind me, the thing that had once been Sarah, or had it just been wearing her like a suit of borrowed flesh, was getting closer. I could feel its hunger radiating like waves of Arctic cold. Not just a physical hunger, but something deeper, a desire to transform, to remake, to break down the barriers between what should and shouldn't be. My rifle had been lost somewhere in the chaos, dropped or transformed or simply ceased to exist. I couldn't remember which. My flashlight flickered and died, but it didn't matter. Everything was illuminated by that sickly, pulsing light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The crystals spreading across the landscape caught and reflected it, creating a kaleidoscope effect that made it impossible to trust what my eyes were telling me. I stumbled into a clearing that hadn't been there seconds before. In its center stood what looked like a doorway made of twisted branches and crystalline growths, through which I could see something, other places, other realities perhaps, landscapes that hurt my mind to look at. And standing before it was Dr. Williams, or what was left of her. She turned to face me, and I saw that the transformation was already halfway complete. Her flesh rippled and flowed like wax, crystal structures sprouting from her skin. Her eyes were gone, replaced by faceted gems that reflected infinite versions of myself back at me. When she spoke, her voice was layered with others, echoing with impossible harmonics. "Henry," she said, "we've discovered something extraordinary. The next step in human evolution." "Why are you running?" "Don't you want to be part of something greater?" Behind her, through that impossible doorway, I caught glimpses of vast, crystalline cities that couldn't exist, of beings that moved through dimensions I couldn't comprehend. The creature was herding me toward this portal, I realized. It wanted me to see what it had to show me, to understand what it was offering before it remade me in its image. What happened next is still jumbled in my mind, like trying to remember the details of a fever dream. I remember running again, but this time with purpose. The creature had shown me too much, revealed the pattern behind its actions. It wasn't just hunting. It was transforming the landscape into something it could inhabit, converting matter and energy and living beings into forms compatible with its native reality. But this process created distortions, weak points in the fabric of our world. I could feel them now, places where the laws of physics bent and buckled. The creature's power had limits. It couldn't maintain these changes across too large an area, not yet. if I could just reach the boundary of its influence. The pursuit became more frenzied. The thing that had been Dr. Williams joined the chase, along with others, transformed members of the research team, their bodies twisted into crystalline hybrid forms. They moved in perfect coordination, trying to herd me back toward that doorway, that portal to somewhere else. The forest around me began to pulse with increasing frequency, the transformations becoming more unstable. Trees would suddenly age centuries in seconds, then reverse back to saplings. Gravity reversed itself randomly, sending me tumbling through space that folded like origami. The voices in my head grew louder, no longer whispering but screaming in languages that made my nose bleed and my teeth ache. Then I saw it. A line in the landscape where the crystalline growths suddenly stopped, where the trees were still just trees, the boundary of the creature's influence. I ran for it with the last of my strength, even as the ground beneath my feet began to dissolve into geometric patterns that tried to climb up my legs. I felt something grab me, a crystalline tendril that burned with impossible cold. It tried to pull me back, and for a moment I saw through its eyes. I saw the vast geometric cities of its home reality, saw the beauty and horror of what it wanted to create here. I saw versions of myself in infinite variations, all of them transformed, all of them perfected in its alien vision. With a scream that was as much defiance as terror, I threw myself forward. There was a sensation like reality itself tearing, a sound that existed more in my mind than in my ears, and then I was lying on normal earth under normal trees, my body racked with pain, but fundamentally unchanged. Behind me, where the creature's influence had been, there was nothing but undisturbed forest. No crystals, no twisted trees, no sign that anything unusual had ever happened there. But the air still carried that metallic tang, and in the distance, I could hear something that might have been Sarah's voice, or Dr. Williams calling me back. They found me 3 days later, dehydrated and hypothermic, babbling about crystal cities and impossible geometries. The search and rescue team discovered me curled up in the hollow of an old cedar tree, 20 miles from the research station. My clothes were frozen stiff despite the mild autumn weather, and my hair had turned white in patches, as if it had been bleached by extreme cold. The official investigation painted a picture that was both mundane and completely wrong. They concluded there had been an accident at the facility, a leak of experimental chemicals that caused hallucinations and drove everyone to flee into the forest. They found no bodies, no traces of Claire or Dr. Williams or any of the others. The research station itself was intact but empty, showing no signs of the crystalline transformations I'd witnessed. But there were inconsistencies they couldn't explain. All electronic equipment from the facility, computers, phones, sensors, had been transformed into inert lumps of crystalline material that scientists couldn't identify. The temperature around the station remained abnormally cold, and sensitive instruments registered bizarre electromagnetic readings that made no sense to the investigators. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital, first in intensive care, then in the psychiatric ward. The doctors diagnosed me with PTSD and acute stress disorder, attributing my stories to trauma and chemical exposure, but they couldn't explain the changes in my body. The patches of skin that sometimes became translucent and crystalline in cold weather, the way electronic devices malfunctioned around me, or why my eyes now reflected light in impossible colors. During my stay, I had visitors. Men in dark suits who asked probing questions about what I'd seen. They seemed particularly interested in the portal, in the glimpses I'd caught of that other reality. They showed me photographs of similar incidents, other places where reality had been thin, they said, where things had slipped through from somewhere else. I got the impression they'd been tracking these occurrences for a long time. Sleep became my enemy. In my dreams, I saw through the creature's eyes again, experienced that alien perspective that found our reality limited and confining. I understood its desire to transform, to perfect our world according to its incomprehensible standards. Sometimes I woke to find my bedroom covered in frost. Complex geometric patterns etched into the ice that faded with the morning light. The years that followed were a struggle to maintain my grip on conventional reality. I moved frequently, unable to stay in one place for long. Electronic devices still acted strangely around me. Computers crashed, phones dropped calls, GPS systems showed impossible locations. I learned to live an increasingly analog life, avoiding technology when possible. But I wasn't the only one affected by what happened at Mount Baker. Over the years, I began collecting stories, reports of similar incidents. A mining operation in northern Canada that uncovered something crystalline and alive in the deep rock. A research station in Antarctica where the ice itself began to transform, forming geometric patterns that drove the witnesses mad. A cave system in New Mexico where spelunkers reported encountering spaces that folded wrong. I made contact with others who'd had similar experiences, survivors who carried their own scars, both physical and psychological. We formed a loose network, sharing information and warnings. Some, like me, had physical changes that marked their encounters. Others were changed in more subtle ways. The ability to perceive things others couldn't, to sense when reality was growing thin. The creature, or others like it, continued to appear. Never in the same place twice, but always following a pattern we began to recognize. Cold spots that shouldn't exist, geometric formations appearing in nature. Animals and people going missing, only to be briefly glimpsed later, transformed into something no longer quite human. 15 years have passed since that night at Mount Baker. I've learned to live with what happened, to accept that my understanding of reality will never be the same. The white patches in my hair have spread, and the crystalline changes in my skin have become more pronounced. Doctors can't explain why I haven't aged a day since the incident, or why my blood sometimes shimmers with rainbow patterns under microscope examination. I still dream of those crystalline cities, of spaces that fold in ways that shouldn't be possible. But I've come to understand that what we encountered wasn't evil, not in any human sense. It was simply different. A being from a reality so foreign to ours that its very presence warped our world to match its own. Its desire to transform wasn't malicious. It was simply trying to make our reality comprehensible to itself, the way humans reshape wilderness into cities and farms. The research station remains abandoned, surrounded by a fence and warning signs about chemical contamination. The government maintains a discreet presence there, monitoring for any signs of renewed activity. Sometimes late at night, hikers report seeing strange lights in the area, or hearing voices that speak in impossible harmonics. I've never gone back, but I know the door is still there, hidden perhaps, but waiting. The creature's influence left a permanent mark on that place, a thinning of the boundaries between what is and what could be. And sometimes, on cold nights when the moon is full, I feel a pull from that direction, a whispered invitation to return and finish what began. But I resist. I've dedicated my life instead to watching, warning, and protecting others from similar incursions. The network I'm part of has grown, a scattered group of survivors and witnesses who understand that reality is far more fragile and fluid than most people realize. We monitor patterns, track anomalies, and do what we can to maintain the boundaries between worlds. Yet there are nights when I look at my reflection, at the crystalline patterns slowly spreading beneath my skin, at the faceted gleam in my eyes, and wonder if I truly escaped that night, or if the transformation is just happening more slowly. Perhaps change, like the creature itself, is patient and inevitable. The woods still have teeth, and they still hunger for transformation. But now I understand that the real horror isn't in the existence of such entities, but in the knowledge that our reality is just one of many, and that the boundaries between them are far more permeable than we'd like to believe. What happened at Mount Baker was just the beginning. The world is changing, Reality itself is shifting, and all we can do is watch, wait, and hope we're ready for whatever comes through the doors we didn't even know existed. I never wanted to be a hero. Hell, I never wanted to be anything special. Just a park ranger doing his job, protecting a slice of wilderness that most people only see in postcards. Sequoia National Forest had been my home for 15 years, ever since I traded my cramped apartment in Sacramento for a cabin on the edge of God knows where. The locals thought I was crazy, giving up city life for solitude. Maybe I was. But there's something about these ancient trees that calls to certain people. We're the ones who feel more at home under a canopy of leaves than a roof of shingles. I grew up reading Jack London and Gary Paulson, dreaming of wilderness adventures while other kids played video games. My parents worried, of course. Their only son, choosing a life of isolation over a proper career. But they didn't understand. Out here, among the towering sequoias and hidden valleys, I found something I never knew I was missing. Peace. The job came naturally. I knew these woods better than most, spent every free moment exploring the lesser-known trails and mapping the forgotten corners. When the ranger position opened up, it felt like destiny. Training was tough. Law enforcement, search and rescue, wildlife management, but I thrived on it. For the first time in my life, everything made sense. That's where I met Davies, fresh out of training, eager as a puppy, with a smile that could charm the bark off a tree. We clicked immediately, two souls who understood the call of the wild. He became more than just a partner. He was family. We shared everything, long patrols, campfire stories, dreams of protecting this ancient place for generations to come. Even our nightmares later when the darkness crept in. Duke came next, a German shepherd rescue with a troubled past. He was supposed to be a service dog, but anxiety made him unsuitable. I saw something in those wary eyes, a kindred spirit seeking sanctuary in the wilderness. Together we patrolled the backcountry, checking on campers, tracking wildlife, and occasionally rescuing lost hikers. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I made other friends too. Earl, the grizzled prospector who knew every creek and hollow in 3 counties. Maria at the general store, who always saved the good coffee for us rangers. The seasonal workers who came and went like migrating birds. We were a tight-knit community, bound together by our love for this wild place. Looking back, I wonder if we were all just playing at being wilderness people. Nature has a way of reminding you how small you are, how fragile. We thought we knew these woods. Thought we understood their rhythms and rules. We were wrong. So terribly wrong. It started with little things. Things easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. Earl was the first to notice, but we brushed off his concerns as the ramblings of an old man who'd spent too much time alone in the hills. The birds ain't singing right, he told me one morning, nursing a cup of coffee at Maria's store. They're spooked. Something's got 'em all riled up. I nodded politely, but I wasn't really listening. We were in the middle of a busy season, dealing with the usual summer crowd of tourists and campers. I had more pressing concerns than quiet birds. Then the hikers started reporting strange things. Unsettling things. A couple from Oregon described waking up to find their campsite rearranged. Not ransacked like a bear would do, but methodically reorganized. Every item had been moved exactly 3 feet to the left. A group of college students swore they heard something mimicking human voices in the middle of the night, calling their names from the darkness between the trees. Duke noticed too. My faithful companion began acting strangely on our patrols, refusing to enter certain areas, growling at shadows. He'd stop dead in his tracks, hackles raised, staring into the forest with such intensity it made my skin crawl. But when I looked, there was never anything there, just ancient trees and deeper shadows. The missing persons reports started trickling in. Nothing unusual at first. The woods claim their share of unprepared hikers every year. But these were different. Experienced outdoorsmen vanishing from well-marked trails. Hunters going missing in pairs. No bodies, No signs of struggle, just empty campsites and abandoned gear. Davies tried to maintain his optimism, but I could see the worry creeping into his eyes. "Maybe we've got a predator problem," he suggested one evening as we wrapped up our patrol. "Mountain lion getting bold, or a bear that's lost its fear of humans." I wanted to believe him, wanted to think we were dealing with something natural, something we could understand and handle. But deep down I knew better. The forest itself was changing, becoming darker, more hostile. The very air felt different, heavier somehow, like the moments before a massive storm. Earl's warnings became more urgent. He'd stop by the station almost daily, his weather-beaten face etched with concern. "There's something wrong in the deep woods," he'd insist. "Something that ain't natural. You boys need to be careful." We should have listened, should have connected the dots sooner. But hindsight's always clearer, isn't it? By the time we understood what was happening, it was already too late. The darkness had taken root and it was hungry. The summer stretched on, hotter and drier than anyone could remember. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The tourist crowds thinned earlier than usual, driven away by an unease they couldn't quite name. Even the locals felt it, a creeping dread that settled over the community like morning fog. I spent more time in the backcountry, telling myself I was being thorough, professional. But truthfully, I was searching. For what, I wasn't sure. Evidence, maybe. Proof that I wasn't imagining the wrongness that seemed to seep from the earth itself. The first real sign came on a Tuesday in late August. I was checking a remote trail when Duke suddenly froze, his entire body rigid with fear. Ahead of us, in a small clearing, lay a perfect circle of dead vegetation. Everything inside it, grass, flowers, even the insects, was completely desiccated, as if something had drained the very life from them. The border was precise, unnatural. One side of a blade of grass would be brown and brittle, the other green and alive. I took samples, photos, measurements, wrote a detailed report. But when I returned the next day with Davies and a Forest Service biologist, the circle was gone. The clearing looked normal, undisturbed. The biologist suggested soil contamination, maybe runoff from old mining operations. Davies nodded, relieved to have a rational explanation, but I saw the doubt in his eyes. That night I couldn't sleep. The forest sounds that usually lulled me to rest felt wrong, discordant. Duke paced restlessly, whining at shadows. Around midnight I heard it. A sound that had no place in these woods. Like metal scraping against metal, but organic somehow, living. It lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. I started keeping a journal, documenting every strange occurrence, every unexplained sound. The pattern was subtle at first, but it was there. The anomalies were spreading outward from a central point like ripples in a pond. And at the center of it all was Blackwood Creek, a place that had always felt slightly wrong, slightly off. Earl's stories about the creek took on new significance. Tales of strange lights, of animals acting unnaturally, of hunters going in and never coming out. Stories I'd dismissed as local folklore suddenly felt more like warnings. September brought early frosts and long shadows. The days grew shorter, but not at the right pace. Anyone who'd spent time in these woods knew the rhythm of the seasons, and this wasn't it. Sunset came too quickly, the darkness too thick, too eager. The woods have been my sanctuary since I was old enough to walk. My father was a forest ranger in the Stanislaus National Forest, and some of my earliest memories are of riding in his green Forest Service truck, bouncing down dirt roads while he taught me the names of trees and birds. He'd point out animal tracks, showing me how to read the stories written in mud and fallen leaves. "The forest speaks," he'd say, "if you know how to listen." I followed in his footsteps, joining the Forest Service right out of high school in 1976. It felt natural, like pulling on a well-worn jacket. The other rangers joked that I had pine sap in my veins instead of blood. Maybe they were right. I knew every trail, every campground, every hidden valley in my sector. The forest was more home to me than my actual house in Arnold. That's where I met Sarah. She was working dispatch when I started, and she had this way of making even the most routine radio check feel like a conversation between old friends. We married in '79, had our ceremony right there in the woods, surrounded by towering sugar pines. Our honeymoon was a week-long backpacking trip through the most remote parts of the forest. Sarah understood me, understood why I needed to be out here. Then there was Duke, my German shepherd. Got him as a pup in '82, trained him myself for search and rescue. He was more than just a working dog. He was my partner, my friend. We'd spent countless hours together in the wilderness, tracking lost hikers, following trails that seemed impossible to read. Duke had instincts I learned to trust more than any fancy GPS or radio. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Search and rescue calls came and went. Most were routine. Lost hikers, injured campers, the occasional missing child. We almost always found them, usually just off the trail, confused but safe. The few we didn't find, well, those were the cases that kept me up at night, made me double-check my gear, study my maps more carefully. I thought I knew these woods. Thought I understood their rhythms, their secrets. Even the darkest corners of the forest felt familiar, like old friends I hadn't visited in a while. But that summer of '87 showed me how wrong I was, how little I really knew about what lived in the deep places, in the shadows between the trees. It started with Tommy Wiles. July 15th, 1987, a Wednesday. The morning broke hot and clear, the kind of summer day that draws people into the woods like moths to flame. I was checking my gear in the station when the call came in. Sarah's voice crackled over the radio, tension evident even through the static. A 9-year-old boy, missing from the Pine Creek campground since lunchtime. I remember pausing as I loaded my pack, a strange heaviness settling in my gut. Something felt off, though I couldn't say what. Duke sensed it too. He was restless, pacing by the truck instead of sitting quietly like usual. I did my standard inventory anyway. First aid kit, extra water, emergency rations, flares, backup radio. My Winchester .30-30 went in last, a precaution against bears and mountain lions that suddenly felt more necessary than usual. Ray Martinez, my human partner of 5 years, met me at the truck. He was former military, built like a boulder and steady as one too. Nothing seemed to rattle Ray, but that morning even he looked uneasy. "Weather's wrong," he said, squinting at the cloudless sky. I knew what he meant. The air felt thick, oppressive, like just before a thunderstorm. But there wasn't a cloud in sight. We studied the map spread across the hood of the truck. Pine Creek Campground was at the edge of our usual patrol area, backing up against some of the wildest territory in the forest. The terrain there was rough, all steep ravines and dense understory. Easy for a kid to get turned around, easier still to get hurt. Tommy's father said he was wearing a red t-shirt, blue jeans, Ray read from his notepad. Carrying a small green backpack. No jacket, no water. He shook his head. Parents said he's an experienced camper for his age, but he's still 9. I finished. We'd seen it before. Kids who thought they knew the woods because they'd been camping a few times. The forest has a way of humbling that kind of confidence. Duke whined from the back of the truck, an unusual sound from him. I reached back to scratch his ears, trying to settle him down. "What's got into you, boy?" I murmured. His eyes, usually warm and bright, were distant, focused on something in the trees I couldn't see. The drive to Pine Creek took longer than usual. The forest seemed different that day, the familiar roads somehow twisted and strange. Shadows lay deeper between the trees, and the usual summer sounds, birdsong, wind in the branches, the buzz of insects, felt muted, as if something was dampening them. We found the campground in chaos. Half a dozen other rangers were already there, along with state police and what looked like every volunteer from 3 counties. Tommy's parents stood by their RV, his mother crying quietly while his father paced, that strange, haunted look in his eyes that I mentioned before. The other campers were talking in hushed clusters, throwing nervous glances at the tree line. I caught fragments of their conversations as I walked past. Just disappeared. Something in the trees. Never seen anything move that fast. Ray and I split up to interview witnesses while Duke worked the ground, trying to pick up Tommy's scent. The stories we heard didn't add up. Some said they'd seen Tommy wandering into the woods alone. Others swore he'd been playing with friends near the bathroom block. But Mrs. Peterson in Site 14, an elderly bird watcher who'd been coming to Pine Creek for 20 years, told us something that made my blood run cold. I was watching a western tanager, she said, her hands trembling as she gripped her binoculars. Such a lovely bird, you know. That's when I saw, well, I'm not sure what I saw. Something big moved in the trees. Not like a bear, more like a shadow becoming solid. Then I heard the boy scream. Duke's bark cut through the campground like a gunshot. He'd found something by the trail that led deeper into the forest. I jogged over, Ray close behind. There in the dirt was a single small footprint, a child's sneaker. Next to it was something else, another print, but not from any animal I recognized. It was huge, nearly twice the size of my boot, with long, curved claw marks at the tips of what might have been toes. The print was fresh, the edges still sharp in the soft earth. Whatever had made it was still out there, and it had Tommy. The drive back to civilization was a blur of red and blue lights, shouted questions, and the acrid smell of antiseptic as paramedics cleaned my wounds. The cuts were deep, 12 stitches across my chest, 8 more on my left arm. But the physical wounds weren't what kept me awake that night or many nights after. Ray and I gave our statements separately. Standard procedure, they said, but I could tell by the investigators' faces that they were looking for inconsistencies in our stories. How do you explain something that shouldn't exist? I stuck to the facts, the size of it, the way it moved, the bodies we found. With each retelling, the words felt more hollow, less real, but the scars were real enough. The lab results came back inconclusive. DNA analysis showed combinations that shouldn't be possible in nature, according to the forensics team. The creature's body was transferred to a secure facility for further study, and that's the last we officially heard about it. Unofficially, rumors spread through the ranger community like wildfire. Similar sightings in other forests, other parks. Always at dusk or dawn, always near caves or deep ravines, always followed by disappearances. Sarah noticed the changes in me first. The way I'd freeze at unexpected sounds, how I kept my rifle closer at hand. Duke changed too. He'd growl at shadows, refuse to enter certain parts of the forest. We had to retire him from search and rescue. His nerves were shot. I understood how he felt. The nightmares started about a week after the incident. Always the same. I'm back in that cave, but this time I'm alone. My flashlight dies, and I hear that sound. That metal-on-metal screech that still makes my skin crawl. But in the dreams, when I turn around, it's not just one creature. There are dozens of them, all with those twisted faces, all reaching for me with 2 long fingers. I wake up screaming more often than not. Then the letters started coming. First from a ranger in Yosemite, describing something similar stalking their trails. Then from a Forest Service worker in Oregon, a park ranger in Colorado, a game warden in Montana. Each story was different, but the details were too similar to be coincidence. Whatever we killed that day wasn't alone. I started keeping a journal, documenting every report, every rumor. Sarah worried I was becoming obsessed, and maybe I was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only scratched the surface of something much bigger. Much older than any of us realized. 3 months after the incident, I got an unexpected visitor. Dr. Elena Martinez from the Cryptozoological Research Institute showed up at my door. She'd heard about our encounter through unofficial channels and had been studying similar cases for years. According to her research, there were stories about these creatures going back centuries. Native American legends, settler accounts, even Spanish colonial records mentioned things that matched our description. They're not just animals, she told me over coffee at my kitchen table. They're too intelligent, too organized. The cave you found, it wasn't just a lair, it was a hunting blind. They're learning, adapting, and they're spreading. Time passes, but some wounds never really heal. I stayed with the Forest Service. Couldn't imagine doing anything else, but I changed. We all did. Ray transferred to desk duty 6 months later. Couldn't handle being in the field anymore. I don't blame him. I've had my moments too, times when a shadow moves wrong or a branch creaks in a certain way, and I'm right back there in that cave. The official report lists Tommy Wiles as another tragic wilderness accident. His parents moved away, couldn't bear to stay in a town so close to where they lost their son. The cave was sealed off, marked as unstable on official maps. But I know better. We all do. I still patrol these woods, still answer search and rescue calls, but I carry more ammunition now and I never go out alone. Duke stays home. He's earned his rest. Sarah worries every time I leave, but she understands. Someone has to be out here, has to know what to look for. The forest speaks, my father used to say, if you know how to listen. These days, I listen more carefully than ever, because sometimes, in the deepest part of night, when the moon is hidden and the stars seem far away, I hear things moving through the trees, things that shouldn't exist, things that hunger. And I wonder, did we really kill it that day? Or did we just make it angry? The woods have teeth. I know that now. And somewhere out there in the shadows between the trees, they're waiting to bite again. To whoever reads this account, take it as both confession and caution. The wilderness is vast, and we've only explored a fraction of what lies in its darkest corners. If you venture into the deep woods, stay alert. Watch the shadows. Listen for that distinctive screech of metal on metal. And if you find yourself alone in the forest at dusk, and the birds go quiet, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, don't try to be brave. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because they're still out there. I know they are. Every missing hiker report that crosses my desk, every strange sound in the night, every unexplained track in the mud reminds me that what we encountered that day wasn't an end. The natural world speaks its own language, one that takes years to learn and a lifetime to understand. During my years as a Pennsylvania park ranger in the 80s and 90s, I became fluent in this language. The way wind moves through trees before a storm, how animals fall silent when predators are near, the subtle signs that tell stories most people never notice. They call me Jimbo now, but back then, I was just Jim. A ranger who found more comfort in wilderness than civilization. September 1992 painted Pennsylvania in its finest colors. The forests were just beginning their annual transformation, patches of gold and crimson appearing among the green like nature's stained glass. I was on one of my regular patrols, the kind where you're more observer than enforcer, when I found the first sign that something was wrong. The claw marks on the tree stopped me cold. In 2 decades of ranger work, I'd seen plenty of bear markings, but these were different. 5 distinct fingers had carved deep into the trunk, the spacing suggesting something far larger than any known predator. The gouges went nearly halfway through the tree's diameter, indicating strength that defied natural law. I should have paid more attention to that warning. Should have recognized it as the first page of a horror story I was about to live through. But that's the thing about experience. It can blind you just as easily as ignorance. I'd seen so many natural phenomena that my mind automatically tried to categorize this within known parameters. Maybe it was multiple bears marking the same spot, I thought. Maybe the tree was already damaged, making the marks appear deeper than they were. I documented it in my patrol log and continued my rounds, letting the beauty of the Pennsylvania wilderness wash away my concerns. Nature has always been my sanctuary. Even now, in retirement, I seek out the quiet places where human influence fades and something older takes over. There's a purity to wilderness that cities can never match, a honest brutality that makes more sense than any human construction. The further you get from civilization, the clearer things become. Or at least, that's what I used to believe. The next morning changed everything. I stepped out of my country home, coffee in hand, ready for another day of patrol when I saw it. The same 5-fingered marks, deep and fresh, on a tree near my house. The property around my home is substantial, the kind of space that lets you forget you have neighbors. But in that moment it felt exposed, vulnerable. I did a quick perimeter check, my ranger instincts kicking in, but found no other signs of intrusion. The rational part of my mind tried to dismiss the connection. Surely it was coincidence or my memory playing tricks on me. The marks couldn't be identical to the ones I'd seen miles away in the park. But another part of me, the part that had learned to trust instinct over logic in the wilderness, knew better. Something had followed me home. The sheriff's cars at the park entrance that morning felt like the second act of a play I hadn't realized I was in. Their red and blue lights looked alien against the natural backdrop. Technology intruding on wilderness. As senior ranger on duty, I approached them with the confidence of someone who still believed in rational explanations. That confidence wouldn't survive the next few minutes. The dead dog they showed me challenged everything I knew about predator behavior. This wasn't a normal kill, not the work of a bear, mountain lion, or wolf pack. The carcass had been systematically destroyed, torn apart with surgical precision that suggested intelligence behind the violence. The claw marks through its body matched the ones I'd seen on the trees, but seeing them in flesh rather than bark made them infinitely more terrifying. The law enforcement officers spoke in careful terms about wild animals and public safety, but I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They'd worked these parts as long as I had, knew the normal patterns of wildlife. This was something else entirely. When they handed me their card and asked me to report anything unusual, their hands trembled slightly. They knew, as I did, that we were dealing with something beyond our experience. That entire day felt wrong, like the world had shifted slightly out of alignment. Anyone who's spent significant time in nature knows the feeling when something's not right. When the usual rhythms and patterns are disrupted by an unseen presence. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper, the familiar trails somehow foreign. Even the birds seemed to sense it, their songs replaced by occasional nervous chirps. During my afternoon break, I returned to the tree with the original markings. Standing there alone, I noticed details I'd missed before. The cuts weren't just deep, they followed a pattern that suggested purpose rather than random aggression. The spacing between each claw mark was mathematically precise, and they all reached exactly the same depth. Whatever had made these marks wasn't just marking territory, it was sending a message. The drive home that evening felt longer than usual. Every shadow along the road seemed to hide potential threats. Every movement in the trees caught my attention. I'd spent decades in these woods, had faced down bears and mountain lions without flinching. But something about those claw marks and the mangled dog had awakened a more primitive fear in me. My dinner that night, a hearty meal of lima beans, rice and deer sausage, should have been comforting. Instead, each bite felt like an act of defiance against the growing unease. The comfort food of my childhood tasted like ash in my mouth, my appetite warring with the knot of dread in my stomach. Still, I forced myself to eat, knowing I'd need the energy for whatever was coming. Sleep, when it finally came, felt like surrender. The food coma pulled me under despite my resistance, my body betraying my mind's desire to stay alert. In hindsight, those might have been my last moments of normal life. The last time I could pretend that the world was exactly what I'd always believed it to be. The banging that woke me wasn't like any normal sound I'd heard in my years of rural living. It wasn't the sharp crack of a fallen branch or the dull thud of a wandering deer bumping against the house. This was purposeful, rhythmic, and powerful enough to make the whole house shudder. Each impact seemed to carry more force than the last, as if whatever was out there was testing the limits of my home's structure. The transition from sleep to full alertness happened in an instant. Decades of ranger training kicking in despite my grogginess. My hand found my shotgun before my feet hit the floor. An old Remington 870 that had been my constant companion through countless wilderness patrols. The familiar weight of it provided little comfort as I moved toward the increasingly violent sounds at my front door. My home's layout, which I'd always appreciated for its simplicity, suddenly felt like a tactical nightmare. The short hallway from my bedroom to the front door offered no cover, and the windows on either side of the entrance would give any observer a clear view of my approach. The door itself was solid oak, reinforced with steel hardware, robust by any normal standard. But the way it flexed and shuddered under the impacts made it look as fragile as cardboard. The decision to fire through the door wasn't made with conscious thought. It was pure instinct. The kind of split-second choice that comes from a lifetime of dealing with wilderness threats. My property was clearly marked with no trespassing signs and warnings about armed response to intruders. Anyone trying to break down my door at night had to know they were risking their life. The shotgun's roar in the confined space was deafening, the muzzle flash momentarily turning night to day. But what happened next defied all expectation. Instead of hearing a cry of pain or the sound of a body falling, the pounding intensified. The hole my shotgun blast had torn through the door revealed nothing but darkness beyond, a darkness that seemed deeper than the night itself. My hands moved automatically to reload, muscle memory taking over while my mind struggled to process what was happening. The phone call to the police was brief and urgent, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Years of radioing in emergency situations helped me convey the essential information quickly. Location, situation, armed homeowner, active threat. But how could I explain that the threat wasn't human? That my door, now hanging from a single hinge, bore claw marks that matched the ones I'd seen in the park. When I finally gathered the courage to approach the ruined door, the marks I saw confirmed my worst fears. These weren't the random gouges of an animal trying to break in. They were deliberate, patterned, identical to the ones I'd documented earlier. 5 fingers, impossibly widespread, deep enough to splinter solid oak. The police would later suggest a bear attack, but I'd seen bear damage countless times. This was something else entirely. The rest of that night became an exercise in sustained terror. I positioned myself in my rocking chair, shotgun across my lap, watching the ruined doorway and every window within my line of sight. The darkness outside seemed alive, moving in ways that darkness shouldn't move. Every sound, from the settling of the house to the wind in the trees, took on new and sinister meaning. Sleep was impossible. Even if I'd wanted to rest, the flood of adrenaline kept me painfully alert. Trauma does strange things to the human mind. It creates a before and an after, with a clear line drawn between them. That night was my line. Everything that came before belonged to a world I understood, where nature followed rules I'd spent a lifetime learning. Everything after belonged to a different reality, one where ancient fears of what lurks in darkness had solid foundation. The following day passed in a blur of practical concerns and suppressed fear. Getting a new door installed became my immediate priority. Not just a replacement, but something stronger, reinforced with additional steel. Each impact mark from the previous night's attack seemed to mock my efforts at security. While the installers worked, I caught them exchanging worried glances at the deep gouges in the old door, their professional demeanor slipping when they saw the extent of the damage. Sleep deprivation played tricks with my mind. Every shadow held potential threats. Every unexpected sound made my hand twitch toward the shotgun I kept within reach. The trauma was setting in, manifesting in ways both subtle and profound. I'd dealt with dangerous situations before, angry bears, territorial moose, even the occasional armed poacher. But this was different. Those threats had been natural, understandable. What I'd encountered defied categorization. When exhaustion finally overwhelmed me that afternoon, my dreams were a chaotic mixture of memory and primal fear. I woke to darkness, my body tensed for fight or flight, the evening having slipped away while I slept. The disorientation of waking in darkness brought back the previous night's terror with crushing force. Each creak of the house, Each whisper of wind through trees carried new meaning. My neighbor's visit the next morning should have been reassuring. Human contact often is after traumatic experiences. Instead, his story about the 12-foot shadow that had been hunting his pigs confirmed my worst fears. The thing that had attacked me wasn't an isolated incident. It was something known to the community, spoken of in whispers, acknowledged only in private conversations between trusted friends. The small-town code of silence around these encounters fascinated and frustrated me. How many others had faced this thing in the darkness? How many had kept their stories to themselves, fearing ridicule or disbelief? The pattern suggested something that had been haunting our region for years, testing boundaries, learning our weaknesses. That night, when the scratching began, I was almost expecting it. The sound of claws dragging along my house's exterior was methodical, exploratory. It reminded me of a predator testing its prey's defenses, looking for weak points. The noise moved around the house in a deliberate pattern, as if whatever was out there was mapping my home's layout. When I gathered the courage to approach a window, the face that appeared turned my blood to ice. Pressing against the glass was something that existed in the space between wolf and human, but belonging to neither category. The window's frame gave me scale. If this was just the creature's head, its full height must have matched my neighbor's description. Its eyes held intelligence that no natural animal should possess, and when it noticed my presence, its expression changed in a way that suggested not just awareness, but recognition. The window's shattering was like an explosion in slow motion. I witnessed each crack spread across the glass before it burst inward, the creature's massive jaws snapping at the space where I had been standing seconds before. My shotgun's response was automatic, the blast illuminating the beast's features in strobing detail that my mind struggled to process. Its face combined the worst aspects of wolf and human, with proportions that violated natural law. The retreat to my bedroom was pure instinct, my feet carrying me upstairs while my mind was still trying to comprehend what I'd just seen. Each shell I loaded into the shotgun felt like a futile gesture against something this massive, this unnatural. The 911 dispatcher's voice on my phone seemed to come from another world entirely. The world of police reports and rational explanations. A world that had no framework for what was currently destroying my home. The sounds from downstairs were a symphony of destruction. Furniture splintered, walls cracked, and beneath it all was a rhythm of movement that spoke of methodical hunting rather than mindless rage. This thing wasn't just destroying my home. It was clearing paths, eliminating obstacles between itself and its prey. The single bound it made up my stairs sent vibrations through the entire house, the sound of its landing making my bedroom floor shake. When it breached my bedroom door, the moonlight through my window revealed its full horror. 12 to 13 feet tall was an underestimate. Even hunched over to fit through the doorway, its shoulders brushed the ceiling. Its fur seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a silhouette that hurt my eyes to look at. Those claws I'd seen marked in trees and doors were even more terrifying in motion, each one looking capable of disemboweling a man with a single swipe. The arrival of police sirens created a moment of surreal hope. The creature's reaction to the sound was fascinating even in my terror. A mixture of annoyance and calculation crossed its features, suggesting a level of reasoning that made it even more terrifying. That moment of distraction was all I had, and I took it, firing more rounds from my shotgun as I made a desperate break for freedom. The impact of its charge felt like being hit by a truck. One moment I was running, the next I was airborne, my bedroom window approaching at terrifying speed. The fall from the second story seemed to happen in slow motion, each rotation giving me a new view of my house, the creature, and the approaching ground. The landing knocked the wind from my lungs and sent my shotgun skittering away, its final shot going off harmlessly into the night. My words to the responding officers, "It's not a bear," became a mantra born of terror and desperation. The phrase repeated itself involuntarily, my mind stuck in a loop as shock took hold. The warm wetness spreading across my pants should have been embarrassing, but in that moment, basic human dignity seemed like a small price to pay for survival. Every law enforcement and emergency response training session I'd ever attended had failed to prepare me for this moment. The police officers' reactions told their own story. Their flashlight beams danced across the destruction of my home, illuminating damage that no known animal could have caused. The claw marks on walls and furniture, the impossible height of the impact points, the sheer scale of destruction. It all painted a picture that their reports would have to somehow rationalize away. I watched their faces as they took in the scene, saw the moment when professional certainty gave way to primal doubt. The following weeks became a blur of insurance claims, contractor visits, and sleepless nights spent at my family's homes. The technical term is acute stress response, but no clinical description could capture the way trauma reshapes your understanding of reality. Every shadow held potential threats. Every unexpected sound sent adrenaline coursing through my system. The woods I'd loved for decades had become alien territory, filled with possibilities I didn't want to contemplate. The decision to return home wasn't made lightly. Pride played a part. This was my territory. My life's work involved protecting these lands. But it was more than that. Running away felt like surrendering to something that shouldn't exist, letting it claim another piece of civilization's shrinking territory. The security measures I installed were extensive. Reinforced doors and windows, motion-activated lights, surveillance cameras covering every approach. Modern technology deployed against an ancient threat. Looking back now, I still can't explain why it never returned. Perhaps the police presence that night drove it to seek easier prey. Or maybe it simply lost interest once I'd proven more trouble than I was worth. The most terrifying possibility, that it's still out there, watching and waiting, is one I try not to dwell on. The claw marks on trees that occasionally appear in the park these days could be from bears. The missing pets and livestock in the area could have natural explanations. But on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind carries strange sounds from the forest, I find myself checking my security cameras more frequently. The shotgun stays loaded and my doors remain triple locked. Because once you've seen something that shouldn't exist, once you've felt the impact of impossible claws and looked into eyes that held ancient malevolence, you never quite believe in safety again. The years since that night have taught me that some experiences fundamentally change how you interact with the world. The Pennsylvania forests I once considered my sanctuary now hold a different kind of mystery. Not just the beauty of nature, but the possibility of things that exist beyond our understanding. Here's what I've learned. The security measures remain in place, regularly updated and maintained. Each new technology offers another layer of protection, though I know in my heart that motion sensors and reinforced doors might mean little against something that could tear through solid oak like paper. Still, they help me sleep at night, and sometimes the illusion of safety is as important as safety itself. Reports still filter through our small community. Whispered stories of enormous shadows moving through woods, livestock found torn apart in ways that defy explanation, deep claw marks appearing on trees and buildings. No one speaks of these things officially, but at local bars and family gatherings, when the hour grows late and guards drop, the stories emerge. Each tale adds to a pattern that suggests the creature, or others like it, continue to haunt our region. The official records from that night remain carefully vague. Police reports mention vandalism and possible bear activity. Insurance claims describe storm damage and break-in attempts. The human mind excels at rationalizing the impossible into comfortable categories, and bureaucracy helps this process along. But the officers who responded that night, who saw the destruction firsthand and heard my terror-stricken mantra about it not being a bear, they know. I've seen it in their eyes at chance meetings around town, the shared knowledge of something we can't discuss. My relationship with nature has evolved rather than diminished. I still love the wilderness, still find peace in its quiet places, but now I carry a deeper respect for its mysteries. Every shadow might hide something ancient and unknown. Every unexplained sound could be a warning. The creature taught me that humanity's dominion over nature is an illusion we maintain through careful attention to boundaries. Boundaries that sometimes prove frighteningly permeable. The trauma has faded to a dull ache. Like an old wound that predicts storms, I've learned to live with the knowledge that something impossible stalked me, attacked me, and for reasons I may never understand, let me live. The experience has left me with questions that have no answers, theories that can't be proven, and a perspective on life that few would understand. For those who've never encountered something truly inexplicable, this might read like a campfire story or a retired ranger's tall tale. But for those who've had their own brushes with the unknown, who've seen things that shouldn't exist and lived to question their sanity afterward, my story might ring uncomfortably true. The woods hold secrets, and sometimes those secrets have teeth, claws, and eyes that shine with ancient intelligence. My name is Ahanu. In the language of my ancestors, it means, he laughs. These days, laughter feels like a distant memory, something that belonged to another life. My grandmother used to say my name carried power, that it would protect me during dark times. I wonder what she would say about the darkness I face now. I took the park ranger position in Denali 3 years ago, not out of some noble calling to protect nature, but because I was running from debt collectors and a failed marriage. The University of Anchorage doesn't hand out environmental science degrees with guarantees, and by the time I graduated, I owed more than I could repay on a researcher's salary. The Park Service offered housing, isolation, and enough income to slowly chip away at what I owed. My cabin sits on the eastern edge of the park, a sturdy one-room structure with a small porch that faces the mountains. In summer, when tourists flood the maintained areas of the park, I barely notice them from my remote outpost. In winter, when the snow piles 6 feet high and the temperature drops low enough to freeze your breath mid-air, I sometimes go weeks without seeing another human face. I used to love the solitude. The quiet gave me space to think, to heal. My grandfather had been a tribal ranger decades before the position was formalized with badges and government paychecks. He taught me to read the land, to understand the wind's warnings and the stories written in animal tracks. I thought I knew what to expect when I took this job. I was wrong. The first indication that something was amiss came last October. I was returning from a 3-day patrol of the eastern boundary, checking for signs of poachers as the hunting season approached. The sun was setting early, as it does in Alaskan autumn, casting long shadows through the spruce. I remember pausing to adjust my pack when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Every ranger experiences this feeling occasionally. Usually it's a curious moose or a black bear assessing whether you're a threat. But this was different. The forest had gone silent. No birds called, no squirrels chattered. Just dead silence and that prickling awareness crawling up my spine. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but about 50 yards back, something stood just inside the shadow of a massive spruce. I couldn't make out details, just a dark figure, too tall and thin to be a bear, too still to be a moose. "Hello?" I called, reaching for the bear spray on my belt. Rangers aren't issued firearms except in special circumstances, something I'd never minded until that moment. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just watched. I took a step forward and it retreated into deeper shadows. By the time I reached the tree where it had stood, nothing remained except a set of tracks in the soft earth that made no sense. They resembled deer prints but walked upright like a human and were spaced too far apart for any natural gait. I've spent my life in these woods. I know every creature that makes its home here. These tracks belonged to none of them. That night in my cabin, I barred the door for the first time since moving in. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that the tracks were probably overlapping prints from different animals and the figure just a trick of the fading light. But I still kept my radio beside my bed and woke at every creak of the cabin's wooden bones. A week later, a hiker went missing. Jason Parrish, 32, from Seattle, experienced outdoorsman who'd ventured off-trail despite warnings about early snowfall. I joined the search team that combed the area where his satellite phone had last pinged. We found his campsite on the second day. The tent was intact, sleeping bag still inside. His cooking equipment was neatly arranged beside a cold fire pit. His backpack rested against a tree, food properly stored in a bear canister. But of Jason, we found only a single boot, standing upright in the center of the clearing, as if he'd simply vanished while standing there. The official report cited wildlife attack, probably a bear. His body was never recovered. I said nothing about the figure I'd seen or the strange tracks. Who would believe me? What would I even say? But as I helped pack up his belongings, I noticed claw marks on a nearby tree. Not the usual marks of a bear sharpening its claws or marking territory. These were deliberate patterns, symbols I didn't recognize but that seemed hauntingly familiar, like something half-remembered from childhood stories whispered by firelight. Stories my grandmother told about creatures that walk between worlds. Stories about skinwalkers. Growing up on the reservation, I'd heard the stories. Not the sanitized versions tourists read about, but the real warnings passed down through generations. My grandmother would lower her voice when she spoke of them. The ye nald lushi, with it, one goes on all fours. Skinwalkers. Never say their name at night, she warned. Never look in their eyes. They'll steal more than your body. They'll take your spirit. As a child, these tales terrified me. As a teenager, I dismissed them as superstition designed to keep kids from wandering into the dangerous wilderness alone. By college, I'd forgotten them entirely, or thought I had. Now, sitting in my cabin with Jason's case file spread across my small wooden table, those stories came rushing back with terrifying clarity. The symbols carved into the tree matched markings my grandmother had once drawn in the dirt, warning me of places I should never go alone. I reached for my phone, intending to call the tribal elder who had taken over after my grandmother passed. The screen showed no service, not unusual this deep in the park. I'd have to wait until morning when I could reach the ranger station's satellite phone. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. October in Alaska means winter's approach, but this cold had a different quality. It felt deliberate, malicious. I stoked the wood stove until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm, but still couldn't shake the chill that had settled in my bones. Sleep came fitfully, troubled by dreams of dark figures standing just beyond my window, of tracks in snow that began as animal prints and slowly transformed to human footprints as they approached my door. I woke at 3:17 a.m. to scratching at my cabin walls. Light, persistent scratching like fingernails on wood. I lay frozen, listening as it moved around the perimeter of the cabin, stopping at each window for several seconds before continuing. When it reached the door, the scratching stopped. In its place came a sound that haunts me still, a perfect imitation of Jason Parrish's voice, using words from the recording on his recovered satellite phone. Hello? Can anyone hear me? I think I'm lost. Every ranger memorizes the names and details of missing hikers. This voice, this exact message had been played during our search briefing. There was no way anyone else could know those precise words. Hello? I need help, please. The voice changed slightly, becoming more desperate but still unmistakably Jason's. Then it shifted, taking on multiple tones simultaneously, as if several people were speaking in perfect unison. Ahanu, come outside. We're lost. My name. It knew my name. I reached for my flashlight with trembling hands, but couldn't bring myself to approach the door or windows. Instead, I huddled in my bed until dawn broke, listening to that terrible voice repeat its pleas and calls throughout the night. When morning finally came, I searched the area around my cabin. The ground, frozen hard overnight, showed no tracks, but on my door, carved into the wood with precision that no human fingernail could achieve, was a single symbol, the same marking from the tree near Jason's campsite. I took a photo with shaking hands before heading to the ranger station. I needed to speak with someone, anyone who might understand what was happening. But as I approached the station, I hesitated. What would I say? That I believed a mythological creature was hunting in the park? That it had specifically targeted me? They'd pull me from duty for psychiatric evaluation. I'd lose my position, my housing, the only stability I'd managed to build after my life collapsed. Instead, I used the satellite phone to call Daniel Blackfeather, an elder from my mother's tribe who lived in Anchorage. I hadn't spoken to him in years, not since my grandmother's funeral, but if anyone would take me seriously, it would be him. "The symbols," he said after I described what I'd seen. "Can you send them to me?" I texted the photos from the station's computer. His silence after receiving them lasted so long, I thought we'd been disconnected. "Daniel? Where are you staying, Ahanu?" His voice had changed, become urgent. "My cabin on the eastern boundary. Leave today, come to Anchorage." I can't just abandon my post. There are hikers still in the park, and those markings are territorial warnings, Ahanu. Not for humans, for other skinwalkers. Whatever is there has claimed that territory, and now it's marked your home. That means it's marked you. For what purpose? I asked, though I feared I knew the answer. Skinwalkers need to steal a person's form, their essence. Usually they target those who are alone, isolated. He paused, like a solitary park ranger. I thought of Jason Parrish, of his empty campsite and single boot. How do I stop it? Daniel's voice lowered. You don't understand. If it's marking territory, this isn't just any skinwalker. It's ancient, powerful. And if it's spoken your name... He trailed off. What? What happens if it knows my name? The old stories say that when a skinwalker learns your true name, it gains power over you. It can call to you, and something inside you will want to answer. That night, I didn't return to my cabin. Instead, I volunteered for overnight surveillance at the main ranger station, claiming I was concerned about recent wildlife activity near my outpost. My supervisor seemed relieved. Budget cuts meant they were short-staffed anyway. As I settled into the station's bunk room, I realized I had no long-term plan. I couldn't avoid my cabin forever, couldn't explain my fear to the other rangers. Sooner or later I would have to face whatever waited for me in the wilderness. And somehow, I suspected it knew that too. Winter came early that year, burying the park under 3 feet of snow before November's end. Tourist season had long since passed, leaving only the hardcore winter enthusiasts and a few research scientists with special permits. I'd been avoiding my cabin, finding excuses to stay at the main station or bunk with other rangers during patrols. My supervisor, Linda, had started giving me concerned looks. I knew my behavior seemed erratic, but I couldn't explain the real reason. "Everything all right, Ahanu?" she asked one morning, as I volunteered for yet another overnight shift at the main station. "You haven't been home in almost 2 weeks." "Just some issues with the heating system," I lied. "Should be fixed soon." She didn't believe me, I could tell from her expression, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she handed me a missing persons report that had just come in. 2 hikers failed to check in last night. University researchers studying wolf migration patterns. They were supposed to return to their base camp by sunset and radio in. I took the report, scanning the details. Dr. Emily Chen and her assistant Marcus Hoffman had permits to track radio-collared wolves in the eastern sector, my sector, near my cabin. "I'll organize a search team," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Weather's turning bad. Forecast says we've got a blizzard moving in tonight. If we're going to find them, it needs to be soon." 3 hours later, I was leading a 4-person team through the increasingly heavy snowfall toward the researchers' last known coordinates. The wind had picked up, driving ice crystals that stung any exposed skin. Visibility was deteriorating rapidly. "We should turn back," called Rodriguez, one of the newer rangers. "We can resume when the storm passes." He was right. Following safety protocols, we should absolutely return to the station. But something pushed me forward. The knowledge that whatever took Jason might now have Emily and Marcus. "Their camp should be just over this ridge," I shouted back. "We'll check it quickly, then head back." We found their camp intact, just like Jason's had been. 2 tents still stood, equipment neatly arranged. Their research materials, laptops, logbooks, sample containers were precisely organized under a tarp shelter. The only signs of disturbance were their open sleeping bags and a half-eaten breakfast. And the tracks. Leading away from the camp, 2 sets of human footprints transformed gradually over the course of 20 yards. With each step, they elongated, deepened, changed until they no longer resembled human prints at all, but the same strange deer-like bipedal tracks I'd seen months before. "What the hell?" Rodriguez knelt beside them, confusion evident on his face. I pulled him back. "Don't touch them." The wind howled, obscuring my words, but Rodriguez must have seen something in my expression because he stepped away from the tracks. The other rangers were examining the tents, oblivious to what we'd found. "Hanson!" I called to our team lead. "We need to go. Storm's getting worse." As if to emphasize my point, a violent gust nearly knocked us off our feet. The snow was falling so heavily now that the tracks were already beginning to fill in. Before we left, I noticed something hanging from a nearby tree branch, a small pouch made of leather, decorated with beadwork in tribal patterns. I recognized it immediately as a medicine bag, similar to one my grandmother had made for me decades ago. I snatched it from the branch and stuffed it into my pocket without letting the others see. Whatever had taken the researchers had left this as a message or a warning. The journey back was treacherous. The blizzard hit with full force, reducing visibility to mere feet. We roped ourselves together to avoid separation, but even so, we nearly lost Rodriguez when he stumbled into a snow-covered depression. By the time we reached the ranger station, night had fallen completely, and the temperature had plummeted to 30 below. Linda met us at the door, her face grave. "No sign of them?" she asked, already knowing the answer. I shook my head. Camp was intact, no indications of where they went. I didn't mention the tracks. How could I explain them? After filing our report, I retreated to the communal break room, finally pulling out the medicine bag to examine it privately. The beadwork formed familiar patterns, protective symbols my grandmother had taught me. Inside was a small piece of paper with a single word written on it: "Leave." The handwriting was Marcus Hoffman's. I recognized it from the research logs we'd found in the camp. Whatever had taken Emily and Marcus, whatever was hunting in my territory, knew I was investigating, knew I suspected the truth, and it was sending me a message. That night, as the blizzard raged outside, I finally called Daniel again. 3 people missing now, I told him, after explaining about the researchers. And I found this medicine bag with a warning. "It's testing you," Daniel said, his voice solemn. "Skinwalkers are patient predators. This one is ancient, powerful. It's playing with you." "Why me?" "There are other rangers, other people in the park. You said your grandmother taught you the old ways. Perhaps it senses that connection. Or perhaps," he hesitated. "What?" "Perhaps it's been watching you longer than you realize. These beings don't think like humans, Ahanu. Their perception of time is different. It might have chosen you years ago, been watching, waiting for the right moment." I thought back to the strange incidents throughout my life. Unexplained noises outside my childhood home. The feeling of being watched when I camped alone as a teenager, animals behaving strangely around me. Had it really been stalking me my entire life? How do I fight it? You don't, Daniel said flatly. You can't defeat a skinwalker through confrontation. The only way to escape is to cleanse yourself of its influence and bind it from following. He described an ancient ritual, one that would require me to return to my cabin, to face whatever waited there. I would need sage, sweetgrass, items of personal significance, and cedar ash from my home fire. The cabin is its territory now, I argued. Exactly. That's where its power is strongest, but also where the binding will be most effective. You must reclaim your space, Ahanu. Otherwise, it will never stop hunting you. After ending the call, I sat alone in the break room, watching the snow swirl violently outside the windows. In the distance, barely audible above the storm, I thought I heard voices calling, Emily's and Marcus's, pleading for help, calling my name. And beneath their voices, something else, a whisper in a language I almost recognized, words that made my skin crawl and my heart race with inexplicable terror. I covered my ears, but the voices continued. They were coming from inside my head. The skinwalker had found me, even here. It was only a matter of time before it took me, just as it had taken the others. I had no choice. I had to return to my cabin. I had to perform the ritual. I had to face the thing that hunted me. The blizzard raged for 3 days, trapping us at the main station. Search efforts for Emily and Marcus were officially suspended until weather conditions improved, though we all knew what that meant. In Alaska's winter wilderness, 3 days was a death sentence. If something else hadn't already killed them, the cold certainly had. I used the time to prepare for what I knew I had to do. From the station's emergency supplies, I gathered what items I could that approximated Daniel's list. Real sweetgrass was impossible to find, but I had a small bundle of sage in my locker, left over from my grandmother's passing. For cedar ash, I'd have to use what remained in my cabin's wood stove, assuming the fire hadn't gone completely cold. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke. The park was transformed. Familiar landmarks buried under snowdrifts 10 feet high, trees bent and broken from the wind's fury. The eastern sector, where my cabin stood, had been hit particularly hard. Roads won't be cleared for at least 2 days, Linda informed us during morning briefing. We'll focus on checking emergency shelters along the main trails first, then move outward to backcountry areas. I volunteered to check the eastern shelters, a transparent excuse to return to my cabin, but one that Linda accepted without question. Perhaps she thought I was eager to check on my home after being away so long. That sometimes reached my waist. By the time my cabin came into view, the short winter day was already fading toward dusk. In the dimming light, the small structure looked different, ominous, unwelcoming. The windows were dark, and snow had drifted halfway up the door. I approached cautiously, scanning the surrounding area for tracks. The fresh snow revealed nothing, but that didn't mean I was alone. After digging away enough snow to force the door open, I stepped inside with my flashlight drawn, heart pounding. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it weeks ago, but colder than I'd ever felt it. My breath clouded heavily in the beam of my flashlight. The wood stove sat cold and lifeless, a thin layer of ash visible through its grate. I quickly set about building a fire, knowing I needed both warmth and the cedar ash Daniel had specified. As flames finally caught and began to spread through the kindling, I examined the cabin more carefully. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet everything felt wrong. The air held a strange scent, like wet fur and something metallic that reminded me of blood. My home no longer felt like my own. I laid out my supplies on the small table, sage bundle, a pouch of tobacco, another item from my grandmother, matches, a small knife, and a photograph of my family from before my parents died. Daniel had instructed me to create a protective circle using these items, then perform a cleansing ritual that would bind the skinwalker from following me. The ritual needed to begin at midnight. I had hours to wait. I tried to eat something, but my appetite had vanished. Instead, I sat by the fire, listening to the wind as darkness fell completely outside. Occasionally the wood would pop, or the cabin would creak under the weight of snow, causing me to jerk toward the sound, pulse racing. At 11, I heard the first voice. Ahanu. Help me. It came from just outside the window, Emily Chen's voice, perfect in every inflection. I escaped it, Ahanu. Please, I'm so cold. Let me in. I didn't move, remembering Daniel's warnings. I can see you through the window, Emily's voice continued. Why won't you help me? It's coming back! Her plea ended in a terrified scream that cut off abruptly. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. Then came Marcus's voice from a different direction. She's gone. It took her when you wouldn't open the door. Your fault. All your fault. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voices continued, joined now by Jason Parrish and others I didn't recognize, perhaps hikers who had gone missing in previous years. A chorus of accusations and pleas surrounding my cabin. At 11:30 they stopped suddenly. The silence was somehow worse, filled with anticipation. A heavy thud landed on my roof, something large moving across the wooden shingles, slow, deliberate steps that no human could make at that angle. I stared upward, following the sound as it moved toward the chimney. The fire flickered, then flared unnaturally bright as a rush of wind blew down the chimney. Ashes swirled across the floor. When the flames settled, they burned with a greenish tint that cast sickly light across the cabin. Nu. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a rasping whisper that barely resembled my name. It wasn't coming through the walls from outside. It was inside with me. I have waited for you, it continued, the sound seeming to circle me like a physical presence. So patient, so hungry. My hands shook as I reached for the sage. It wasn't midnight yet, but I couldn't wait. Whatever ritual Daniel had planned, I needed to start now. Your grandmother knew me, the voice whispered, now directly behind me. She offered another in your place, but I wanted you. Always you. I spun around, but saw nothing. The cabin appeared empty except for shifting shadows cast by the unnatural fire. You lie, I said, my voice cracking. My grandmother protected me from things like you. A low laugh rippled through the air. Is that what you believe? Ask yourself why she taught you about my kind, why she showed you the symbols. She was preparing you, marking you. No, I struck a match with trembling fingers and lit the sage bundle. Smoke curled upward, fragrant and grounding. You're trying to confuse me. Look at the photograph, Ahanu. Look closely. Against my better judgment, I glanced at the family photo I'd placed on the table. In the flickering green-tinged light, details emerged that I'd never noticed before. My grandmother stood behind me, her hand on my shoulder. Her fingers formed an unnatural shape, and now I could see that she was wearing a small pouch around her neck, identical to the one I'd found at the researchers' camp. No, I repeated, but with less conviction. She bought her safety with your future, the voice insisted, a bargain made when you were just a child. Did you never wonder why she taught you to recognize skinwalker signs? Why she made you memorize the rituals? She was preparing you for me. I began to move around the cabin, waving the smoking sage in the pattern Daniel had described, trying to ignore the voice and its poisonous words. Your elder friend sent you back to me, it continued. He knows the old ways, knows the bargains made. Did he tell you this ritual would save you? It won't. It will complete the transaction, bind you to me instead of driving me away. My movements faltered. Was Daniel part of this too? Had he deliberately sent me into a trap? No. This was what skinwalkers did. They created doubt, confusion. They turned you against those who might help you. I continued the ritual, sprinkling tobacco at the four corners of the cabin, reciting the words Daniel had taught me. As I spoke, the presence seemed to retreat slightly, the whispering growing fainter. Emboldened, I moved faster, completing the circle and returning to the table for the final component, the cedar ash from my own hearth. As I reached for the container of ash I'd collected, the fire suddenly extinguished, plunging the cabin into complete darkness. My flashlight left on the table flickered and died as well. In the absolute black, I sensed movement. Something was in the cabin with me, something that breathed with wet, rasping sounds, something that smelled of decay and wild places. "Grandmother betrayed you," it whispered, now so close I could feel its breath on my face. "Daniel betrayed you. I am the only truth you have left." Its hand, if you could call it that, touched my cheek. The contact burned like ice, sending pain shooting through my skull. I cried out, stumbling backward until I hit the wall. "See me," it commanded. "See what you will become." My vision changed, though there was no light in the cabin. I could suddenly perceive shapes, outlines like heat signatures or auras, and standing before me was a figure that defied description. Part deer, part human, its proportions all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Its head bore antlers that scraped the ceiling, and its face— I can't describe its face. I won't. Some horrors should remain unspoken. "The transformation has already begun," it said, and I realized with dawning horror that I shouldn't be able to see in this darkness at all. Something had changed in my perception, something fundamental. With desperate strength, I lunged toward where I remembered the table being, my hand closing around the container of ash. I flung it toward the creature, simultaneously shouting the final words of Daniel's ritual. The ash seemed to hang in the air, illuminated by some inner light. For a moment it outlined the creature perfectly, confirming the nightmare I'd glimpsed. Then everything exploded into blinding white. When my vision cleared, I was alone in the cabin. The fire burned normally in the wood stove. My flashlight shone steadily on the table. Everything appeared ordinary, except for the mirror above my small sink. In its reflection I could see myself, but something was wrong with my eyes. They reflected the light like an animal's, glowing faintly green in the dimness. And behind me, just over my shoulder, stood the skinwalker, its monstrous form fully visible, though I saw nothing when I spun around. Only in reflections could I see the truth now. The transformation had begun, just as it had warned. I had completed the ritual, but not as Daniel intended, not as I had hoped. I had bound myself to the skinwalker, just as my grandmother had arranged long ago. And now I understood why the park had always felt like home. I fled the cabin before dawn, taking only what I could carry in a small backpack. The snow had crusted overnight, making travel easier than the day before. I moved quickly, desperate to put distance between myself and what had happened, though I understood now that distance meant nothing. The skinwalker wasn't following me, it was becoming me. The changes were subtle at first: enhanced night vision, heightened sense of smell, and awareness of animals hiding beneath the snow that no human should possess. I could hear heartbeats through the trees, taste fear on the wind. By midday, I reached the ranger station, but couldn't bring myself to go inside. What if the others saw something wrong in my eyes? What if I endangered them by bringing this curse into their midst? Instead, I radioed in, claiming my cabin had sustained storm damage and I needed to make repairs. Linda sounded concerned but accepted my explanation. I requested supplies be left at drop point 4, far enough from the station that I wouldn't need to interact with anyone. Search teams found no sign of the researchers, she informed me. We're waiting for conditions to improve before bringing in cadaver dogs. They won't find anything, I said before I could stop myself. What makes you say that? I fumbled for an explanation. The storm. It covered everything. Tracks, evidence. If they're out there, the snow has buried them completely. Linda was silent for a moment. Are you sure you're okay, Ahanu? You sound different. Just tired, I lied. I'll check in tomorrow. I spent that night in one of the emergency shelters, a small A-frame structure stocked with basic survival supplies. As darkness fell, hunger gnawed at me, a hunger no trail rations could satisfy. I caught myself staring at the tracks of a snowshoe hare, salivating at the thought of raw meat, warm blood. I forced myself to eat energy bars instead, washing them down with melted snow. They tasted like ash in my mouth, providing no satisfaction. Sleep brought nightmares, visions of running on all fours through moonlit forests, hunting not animals but humans. I saw through the skinwalker's eyes as it stalked its prey, felt its exhilaration as it closed in for the kill. Worse, I felt my own pleasure in the chase, my own anticipation of the feast to come. I woke gasping, my body drenched in sweat despite the freezing temperature. In the small, shatterproof mirror of my survival kit, my eyes now glowed openly, no longer requiring darkness to reveal their changed nature. My teeth felt different too, not quite fangs, but sharper, designed for tearing flesh. I needed help. Real help, not the half-truths Daniel had provided. I needed someone who understood what was happening to me, someone who might know how to reverse it. I thought of my grandmother's sister, Kimmy, who lived in a remote village 200 miles north. She had never approved of my grandmother's dealings with the old ways, had warned me as a child to be wary of the gifts my grandmother offered. At the time, I thought it family drama, the feuding of elderly siblings. Now I wondered if she had been trying to protect me. Using the emergency shelter's satellite phone, I managed to leave a message with the village council office. Whether Kimi would receive it, whether she would respond, I couldn't know, but it was my only hope. The transformation accelerated over the next 3 days. My hunger grew insatiable, my senses increasingly inhuman. I began to hear the thoughts of animals nearby, their simple desires and fears flooding my consciousness. My joints ached constantly as bones shifted beneath my skin, preparing for changes I desperately fought to prevent. On the 4th day, I received a reply from Kimmy, coordinates for a meeting point and a simple instruction. Come alone. Trust no one else. The location was a 3-day journey on foot in my current condition, a small hunting cabin on tribal land that bordered the national park to the north. I set out immediately, moving mainly at night when my new vision gave me advantage and the bitter cold kept other humans away. As I traveled, I began to piece together what had happened. My grandmother, a respected medicine woman, had made a deal with the skinwalker decades ago. Protection for her family and power for herself, in exchange for a successor. Me. The rituals and teachings she'd passed down weren't protective measures as I'd believed, but preparation, conditioning to make me receptive to the transformation. The skinwalker had been patient, waiting until I returned to the land of my ancestors, until I was isolated and vulnerable. The missing hikers were simply catalysts designed to push me toward the confrontation in my cabin and the ritual that would bind us together. On the 2nd night of my journey, I encountered a wolf pack hunting in the moonlight. Instead of fearing me, they approached cautiously, respectfully. The alpha, a massive gray female with amber eyes, addressed me not in words but in images and sensations that translated clearly in my mind. You walk between. Not prey, not predator. Not yet, I responded instinctively, projecting my own thoughts back. I don't want this change. The alpha circled me, her pack maintaining distance. Change comes to all. Some fight, some surrender. The wise shape it to their will. How? Accept the hunger, but choose the prey. Before I could ask more, the pack vanished into the trees, leaving me alone with this cryptic advice. Accept the hunger, but choose the prey? What did that mean? That I could direct these urges toward animals instead of humans, or something else entirely? By the time I reached Kimmy's coordinates, I was barely recognizable as human. My movements had become fluid, predatory. I could travel for hours without tiring. Small animals froze in terror when I passed. Even the weather seemed to respond to my presence, snow squalls forming and dissipating around me as I moved. The cabin stood in a small clearing, smoke rising from its chimney. Before I could approach, the door opened and an elderly woman stepped onto the porch. Despite never having met her as an adult, I knew immediately that this was Kimi. She carried herself with the same straight-backed pride as my grandmother, but her eyes held warmth where my grandmother's had always been calculating. "I've been waiting, nephew," she called. "I've felt your approach since yesterday." I stepped into the clearing, suddenly self-conscious about my appearance. Would she see the changes in me? Would she recoil in horror? Instead, she simply nodded as if confirming something she already knew. "My sister's work is nearly complete," she said. "But not quite. There is still time." Time for what? To choose. She invited me inside, where a fire burned brightly, and the scent of cooking meat made my transformed senses sing with hunger. She served me a stew of rabbit and roots, the first food that had satisfied me in days. As I ate, she explained what my grandmother had done, and why. "Our bloodline has always been susceptible to the call," she said. "Some families are, the old ones, the skinwalkers. They seek us out, generation after generation. Your grandmother didn't sacrifice you on a whim. She was chosen herself as a young woman, but she found a way to defer it, to pass the burden forward." "To me," I said bitterly. Kimi nodded. "It should have been her, but she found a loophole in the ancient pact. A blood successor could take her place. She chose you, her favorite grandchild." I set down my spoon, appetite suddenly gone despite the gnawing hunger. How do I stop it? How do I reverse what's happening to me? Kimi's weathered face grew solemn. "You don't understand, Ahanu. The transformation cannot be reversed once begun, but it can be directed." "What does that mean?" She rose from her chair and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. From it she withdrew a bundle wrapped in deerskin. "There are two paths before you now. In one, the skinwalker consumes you entirely. Your consciousness fades. Your humanity becomes nothing but a memory, a mask it wears when convenient. You become a predator of your own people." The bundle, when unwrapped, revealed a necklace made of carved bone and leather, adorned with symbols similar to those I'd seen in the forest. "And the second path?" I asked, afraid of the answer. "You consume it." Kimi's eyes locked with mine. "You accept the transformation but maintain dominance of your human mind. You become something new, neither fully human nor fully skinwalker, but a guardian who walks between worlds." "A guardian? Why do you think these creatures exist, nephew?" "Everything in nature has purpose. Skinwalkers are predators, yes, but they are also protectors of boundaries, between worlds, between wilderness and civilization. They keep balance. They remind humans of their place in the natural order." She held out the necklace. "This was made by our ancestors 7 generations ago. She was the first in our line to make this choice. It will help you control the transformation, channel the power." I hesitated before taking it. "And if I refuse both paths? If I fight the change completely?" Kimi's expression softened with pity. "Then you will go mad as your mind tears itself apart between human and other. Those who resist become the most dangerous of all, mindless hunters driven only by pain and hunger, unable to distinguish friend from prey." As she spoke, I felt the truth of her words resonate within me. The constant struggle to maintain my humanity was already wearing me down. How long could I continue before breaking completely? I took the necklace, its weight surprisingly heavy in my palm. "What do I do?" "Complete the transformation, but on your terms. Accept the hunger, but choose your prey." Kimi echoed the wolf's cryptic advice. "The skinwalker chose you because of your connection to this land, your knowledge of the park. It needs that knowledge to hunt effectively." "So I'd be helping it kill?" "No, you'd be directing its hunger toward those who threaten the balance. Poachers, those who harm the land deliberately, those who would bring destruction to wild places." I fingered the bone charms on the necklace, considering her words. "Become a monster to fight monsters. And the people who've already disappeared. Jason, Emily, Marcus." Kimi's gaze dropped. "I cannot restore what has already been taken, but you can prevent more senseless deaths." That night, as moonlight filtered through the cabin's single window, I made my choice. I placed the necklace around my throat and stepped outside into the snow. The transformation I'd been fighting rushed over me like a flood, but this time I didn't resist. I surrendered to it, yet remained aware, watching from within as my body changed. Elongated, became something no longer human. The pain was excruciating but brief. When it ended, I stood on 4 legs, my senses sharper than I'd ever imagined possible. I could smell every animal for miles, hear the crystalline structure of snow adjusting to temperature changes, see the magnetic fields of the earth shimmering in the air around me, and I could feel the skinwalker's presence, not as a separate entity, but as part of me, a shadow self that both was and wasn't a Hanu. I ran that night, testing my new form, learning its capabilities and limitations. The speed was intoxicating, the power in my transformed muscles allowing me to cover miles in minutes. When hunger struck, I took down an elk with ease, feasting on its warm flesh with neither disgust nor remorse. It was simply nature now, predator and prey, the cycle that had existed long before humans walked the earth. By dawn, I had returned to Kimmy's cabin, shifting painfully back to human form as the first light touched the horizon. She waited on the porch, unsurprised by my blood-streaked appearance. "You've chosen, then," she said simply. I nodded, touching the necklace that still hung around my throat. "I have questions." "Of course you do, but some answers can only come through experience." She handed me clean clothes and a steaming cup of tea. "Rest today. Tomorrow you must return to your duties. The park needs its guardian now more than ever." As I sipped the bitter tea, I realized what she meant. Winter still gripped the land. More visitors would come for the aurora viewing season. More researchers would brave the cold for their studies. And not all dangers came from the supernatural. How will I explain my absence? The changes that people might notice? Kimmy smiled faintly. "Humans see what they expect to see, nephew. Your colleagues will notice you seem more comfortable in the wilderness, more attuned to tracking. They'll attribute it to your heritage, to skills passed down through generations. They won't see the truth unless you allow them to." She was right. When I returned to the ranger station 3 days later, Linda remarked only that I seemed more rested, that perhaps the time alone had been good for me. If she noticed how I now moved with predatory grace, how my eyes sometimes caught the light strangely, she didn't mention it. The hunger remained a constant companion. But as Kimmy had promised, I could direct it now. Channel it, choose my prey. And in the park that winter, I found plenty of worthy targets. Spring came late to Denali. Snow lingered in the valleys well into May, and the rivers ran high with meltwater. As the land awakened, so too did human activity in the park. Hikers and campers returned, researchers resumed their projects, and with them came those who viewed the wilderness as something to exploit rather than respect. I'd settled into my new existence with surprising ease. By day, I performed my ranger duties with enhanced efficiency. My transformed senses made tracking lost hikers trivial. I could follow scent trails days old, distinguish between different boot treads by touch alone, hear calls for help from miles away. My colleagues attributed my new skills to intensive winter training, a story I encouraged. A few, like Rodriguez, seemed uneasy around me now, but most accepted the changes as positive. I'd become the ranger they called when standard search methods failed, when time was critical. By night I hunted, not for sport or sustenance, though the hunger demanded regular feeding. I hunted those who endangered the balance Kimmy had spoken of. Poachers targeting denning wolves, drug producers setting up remote operations in the backcountry, trophy hunters exceeding their permits or targeting protected species. I never killed humans. The memory of Jason, Emily, and Marcus haunted me still. Instead, I ensured the transgressors were driven from the park, their operations dismantled, their presence reported to authorities who could handle them legally. Sometimes this meant destroying equipment or supplies. Sometimes it meant herding them into situations where ranger patrols would discover them. And if I occasionally manifested just briefly in their peripheral vision a glimpse of something impossible that left them questioning their sanity, perhaps that too served a purpose. Fear can be a powerful deterrent. Twice that spring I encountered others like me, skinwalkers from different territories, drawn by rumors of my existence. The first came as a challenger, an older entity that resented my claim on what it considered unclaimed hunting grounds. We fought under a blood-red moon, a battle I barely survived. My victory earned me not just continued domain over my territory, but something unexpected: respect from the other ancient ones. The second came seeking alliance, offering knowledge in exchange for hunting rights. From this visitor I learned more about what I had become. Skinwalkers weren't a single type of being, but a category. Shapeshifters who had transcended ordinary human limitations through various means. Some, like me, were merged with ancient spirits. Others had achieved their state through forbidden rituals or cursed objects. All walked the boundary between human and other, between physical world and spirit realm. All served a function in maintaining cosmic balance, though many had forgotten their purpose or corrupted it to serve their own desires. In late July, a prestigious research team arrived to study climate change impacts on alpine ecosystems. Among them was Dr. Sarah Blackwood, a cultural anthropologist with a secondary interest in indigenous legends. When we were introduced during their orientation briefing, she studied me with unusual intensity. "Ahanu," she repeated after hearing my name. "That's Algonquin, isn't it?" He laughs. I nodded, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. Something about her gaze suggested she saw more than others did. "Interesting choice for a park ranger in Alaska," she continued. "Your family isn't Algonquin, though. Your features suggest Athabascan heritage." "My grandmother chose it," I said shortly. "Is there something specific your team needs for your research?" She smiled apologetically, but her eyes remained sharp. "Just curious about local perspectives. Perhaps we could talk sometime. I'd like to hear about any traditional ecological knowledge that might inform our work." I agreed reluctantly, suspecting her interest went beyond academic curiosity. My suspicion proved correct when 3 days later, she approached me as I performed maintenance on a trail near their research site. "I know what you are," she said without preamble, her voice low despite no one else being within earshot. "Or rather, what you've become." I continued working, driving stakes into soft ground to mark the trail. "I'm not sure what you mean, Dr. Blackwood." "My grandmother was like you," she continued. "A guardian for the Smokies in Tennessee. She taught me to recognize the signs." I drove another stake with unnecessary force, splintering its top. "And what exactly do you think those signs are?" "The way animals respond to you. The tracks you leave that change subtly when you think no one is watching. The fact that poaching incidents have dropped 70% in this sector since winter." She stepped closer. "The way your eyes reflect light when you don't control it." I finally looked at her directly. "What do you want? Why approach me?" "Because something's coming. Something that requires more than one guardian to address." Over the following weeks, Sarah shared what her grandmother had told her. Warnings passed down through generations of those who knew the truth about skinwalkers and similar beings. Climate change wasn't just affecting physical ecosystems. It was thinning the boundaries between worlds. Ancient things long dormant were stirring. Entities far more dangerous than ordinary skinwalkers were finding pathways into our reality. "The old barriers are failing," she explained one evening as we sat beside a small fire near my cabin. "Things that were sealed away millennia ago are finding ways through. Your predecessor, the one that transformed you, was probably one of the more benign guardians. It at least remembered its purpose enough to ensure continuity. By forcing the transformation on an unwilling human," I said bitterly. Sarah shrugged. "Better than the alternative. Without guardians, the incursions would go unchecked. At least you retained your humanity, your moral compass. Some of what's coming through now lacks even that basic restraint." She spoke of manifestations already occurring in other wilderness areas, hikers encountering temporal anomalies in Yellowstone, strange lights and unexplained phenomena in Olympic National Park, entire research teams disappearing in the Everglades only to reappear weeks later with no memory of where they'd been. "We're organizing," she told me, "connecting guardians across territories, creating networks to monitor and respond. Will you join us?" I considered her offer carefully. My responsibility had been to this park, these mountains and valleys that had become my territory. But if what she described was true, a broader threat required a broader response. "I'll help," I finally agreed. "But Denali remains my priority. Of course, each guardian maintains their territory. We're simply creating channels of communication, protocols for mutual aid when necessary." That fall, as the days shortened and the northern lights danced with increasing frequency, I began to understand the urgency behind Sarah's warnings. The boundaries she'd spoken of grew more permeable with each passing week. Visitors reported strange sightings, figures that appeared and disappeared, lights that moved with apparent intelligence, areas of forest where time seemed to flow differently. Rangers found inexplicable tracks, nothing I recognized from either my human knowledge or my skinwalker senses. Electronic equipment failed randomly throughout the park. Wildlife behaved erratically, with entire herds changing migration patterns established for generations. In late September, 3 backpackers disappeared from a popular trail, their campsite undisturbed much like Jason's had been. I tracked them for days, following signs only I could perceive. Tears in the fabric between worlds, remnant energy signatures that led to places where reality itself seemed to fold. I found them. Eventually, huddled in a cave that shouldn't have existed, a space that seemed to occupy multiple locations simultaneously. They were alive but disoriented, unable to explain how they'd arrived there or what they'd seen. As I led them back to safety, one of them turned to me with vacant eyes. "It spoke to us," he whispered. "It said the old agreement is ended. The doors are opening. They're all opening." That night, I transformed fully and ran to the highest peak in my territory. From that vantage point, with my enhanced senses, I could perceive what remained hidden to human eyes. The aurora above was not merely a geomagnetic phenomenon, but a visible manifestation of colliding realities. Within its shifting curtains, shadows moved with purpose, watching, waiting, testing the boundaries. An invasion was coming. Not of beings like me, creatures that straddled the boundary between human and other, but of entities that had never been human, never walked the physical world as we understood it. Ancient intelligences that viewed our reality as territory to be conquered, humans as resources to be harvested. And standing between them and this world was a scattered network of guardians like myself. Former humans who had been transformed not as curse or punishment, but as necessary evolution. We were the defenders of boundaries, the watchers at the threshold. As winter descended once more upon Denali, I accepted what I had become with new purpose. The hunger that had once terrified me now served as fuel for the battles to come. The changes I had fought against had prepared me for a role I could never have imagined. My name is Ahanu. In the language of my ancestors, it means, "he laughs." These days, I rarely find reason for laughter. But I found purpose in the darkness, strength in transformation, and unexpected allies in a war most humans will never know is being fought. I am the guardian of boundaries, the protector of thresholds, the skinwalker who chooses to remember his humanity. And as the lights dance above the frozen wilderness, as ancient things stir beyond the veil of ordinary reality, I stand watch. For this is my territory, my responsibility, my eternal hunt.